Nurse Linda Stevens froze mid-stride, the metal tray of gauze and antiseptic clattering to the floor. What had been a routine wound cleaning for the elderly patient suddenly became anything but routine. The red bumps weren't just infected. Something inside them was moving. "Oh my God!" Dr. Reynolds stumbled backward, knocking over an IV stand. The emergency room fell silent, all eyes fixed on Walter Thompson's exposed arm, where the skin bulged and shifted as if something alive was trying to escape. A young resident turned away, hand pressed against her mouth. Walter stared at his own flesh with detached curiosity, as if watching a nature documentary rather than his own body's betrayal. Just yesterday, he'd been sipping coffee in his apartment, dismissing the pain as another indignity of aging. "Get Dr. Blackwell, now!" The charge nurse's voice cracked as she reached for the phone with trembling fingers. How could a proud man's refusal to seek help, to admit weakness, lead to this moment of horrific revelation? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Walter Thompson had never imagined his life would come to this, lying in a hospital bed while doctors stared at his skin with a mixture of horror and fascination. At 60, his weathered hands told the story of a man who had built things, good things, homes for families, bridges that connected communities, structures that would outlast him by decades. But those capable hands now lay useless against the starched white sheets, trembling slightly with fever and fear. The apartment in Millfield where he'd lived for the past 3 years was a far cry from the 2-story colonial he'd shared with Martha for nearly 4 decades. After her death from breast cancer 5 years ago, the medical bills had forced him to sell. Downsizing, he'd called it to Sarah, his voice carefully constructed to sound like this was a choice rather than a necessity. His daughter had offered to help, she always did. But Walter was from a generation of men who carried their own burdens. The walls of his small apartment were decorated with fading photographs. Walter in his army uniform before shipping out to Vietnam, Martha in her garden laughing at the camera, Sarah in her cap and gown, the first Thompson to graduate college. These memories were his most valuable possessions now, worth more than the meager savings that dwindled with each month's prescription costs. His routine had been simple before the bumps appeared: chess in the park on Tuesdays with other veterans, the library on Thursdays where Mrs. Patterson, the librarian with kind eyes and a wedding ring long worn thin, would set aside history books she thought he might enjoy. Sunday calls with Sarah, conversations filled with careful omissions on both sides, his financial struggles, her worries about him living alone. The neighborhood wasn't much, but it had Eleanor Jenkins next door, a widow who sometimes brought over soup and stayed too long talking about her grandchildren. Walter pretended to be annoyed, but the truth was he looked forward to her visits. They were a reminder that he hadn't completely disappeared from the world. Medicare covered some things, but not enough. Each month brought the same calculation. Which medications could he skip? Which bills could wait? The so-called golden years felt more like surviving on fool's gold. When the first red bumps had appeared on his forearm, Walter had looked at them with resignation rather than concern. Just another indignity of aging, he'd thought. Just another thing he couldn't afford to fix. "I've dealt with jungle rot in Nam," he told his reflection in the bathroom mirror. "This is nothing." But something in his eyes, those faded blue eyes that Martha used to say reminded her of summer skies, revealed the lie. Even then, some part of him had known this wasn't just another rash. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Walter first noticed the bumps on a Tuesday morning in late September. He'd been reaching for the coffee filters in his kitchen cabinet when a shaft of sunlight caught his forearm, illuminating 3 small red welts just below his elbow. He scratched them absently, attributing the irritation to the changing weather, or perhaps the new laundry detergent on sale at the Dollar General. Nothing worth fussing over. By Friday, the 3 bumps had become 7, and the itching had intensified to the point where Walter caught himself scratching in his sleep, waking to find tiny crescents of blood under his fingernails. Still, a trip to the doctor meant $45 for the copay, money that was already allocated to his heart medication. He'd survived worse discomforts, much worse. "Just need to wait it out," he muttered to the framed photo of Martha on his nightstand. In the picture, she was sitting on their front porch swing, her smile bright, despite the chemotherapy that had thinned her hair. "Duh, remember that poison ivy from the Johnson Project? This is nothing compared to that." He shuffled to the bathroom and rummaged through the medicine cabinet, pushing aside orange prescription bottles until he found an ancient tube of hydrocortisone cream. The expiration date had long faded, but he squeezed a small amount onto his fingertip anyway and dabbed it on the angry red spots. The relief was minimal and fleeting. At the Millfield Public Library the following Thursday, Walter kept his arms covered despite the unseasonable warmth. Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow at his long sleeves, but said nothing as she handed him a book on Civil War battlefields. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Walter felt a momentary pang, not of attraction, but of simple human contact. How long had it been since someone had touched him with purpose and care? Not since Martha. "You're looking a bit peaked today, Mr. Thompson," Mrs. Patterson observed, her voice lowered in library-appropriate concern. "Everything all right?" "Just fine," Walter assured her, the lie coming easily after decades of telling Martha he wasn't tired during her illness, telling his foreman he wasn't in pain after an accident on site, telling Sarah he had plenty to live on. Just a touch of seasonal allergies. That night, he received Sarah's weekly call. His daughter's voice came through the phone line crisp and professional, even when discussing personal matters. She'd inherited that from him, the ability to compartmentalize, to present strength regardless of circumstance. "How's the new medication working, Dad? Any side effects?" Walter glanced down at his arm, where the bumps had begun to cluster in a pattern that reminded him uneasily of the tropical rash a buddy had developed in Vietnam. "Nothing worth mentioning. Doctor says my numbers are looking good." Another lie. He hadn't been to the doctor in 3 months. "Good. That's good," Sarah replied, and Walter detected a hint of distraction in her tone. "Listen, I might not be able to call next Sunday. There's a big client presentation, and then I have some appointments I can't reschedule." "Everything okay with you, sweetheart?" Walter straightened in his recliner, parental concern momentarily overriding his own discomfort. "Just busy, Dad. You know how it is in corporate America. They own your soul and rent you your time." She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I'll try to call when I can." After hanging up, Walter sat in the growing darkness of his living room, the only light coming from the muted television where a pharmaceutical commercial showed smiling seniors riding bicycles and playing with grandchildren. He scratched his arm and winced as one of the bumps seemed to throb in response. The next morning he woke to find his sheets spotted with blood. The bumps had multiplied and spread to his shoulder and upper chest. Some had developed a disturbing central depression, like tiny volcanoes with their tops blown off. When he showered, the hot water made them sting and burn until he had to turn the temperature to lukewarm. Walter made coffee with shaking hands and opened his laptop, a refurbished model Sarah had insisted on buying him 2 Christmases ago. "So we can video chat," she'd explained, though they rarely did. Now he navigated to a medical symptoms website and typed "red bumps with holes, itching, spreading." The results were varied and unsettling. Bed bugs, scabies, various fungal infections, allergic reactions. One site mentioned a tropical condition called myiasis, but Walter closed that tab quickly after seeing the accompanying images. No, this was something simple. something that would clear up with the right over-the-counter treatment. At the neighborhood pharmacy, Walter studied the shelves of creams and ointments, trying to decipher which might address his condition without drawing attention to himself. The young pharmacist, his name tag read Steve, approached with the overeager helpfulness of someone new to customer service. "Can I help you find something, sir?" Walter cleared his throat. "Just looking for something for a rash. Nothing serious." Steve's eyes flickered to Walter's hand, which was unconsciously scratching at his arm through his shirt sleeve. "What kind of rash? Maybe I can recommend something specific." "Just some red bumps. Probably an allergic reaction." Walter reached for a generic anti-itch cream, eager to end the conversation. "If it's spreading, you might want to have a doctor look at it," Steve suggested. "Some rashes can indicate underlying conditions, especially in—" he hesitated, clearly searching for a diplomatic term, "more mature individuals." "I'll keep that in mind," Walter replied stiffly, heading for the checkout counter. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford to lose, even as his body betrayed him in new and frightening ways. That night, the itching became unbearable. Walter ran a washcloth under cold water and pressed it against the worst of the bumps, finding momentary relief. In the harsh bathroom light, he noticed that the central depressions in some of the larger bumps seemed to be widening. One appeared to have a tiny dark speck visible in its center. He leaned closer to the mirror, squinting to compensate for the reading glasses he'd left in the other room. Was it moving? No, that was impossible. Just a trick of the light or his tired, strained eyes making things appear worse than they were. He applied more cream, took 2 Benadryl from the nearly empty bottle and retreated to bed, trying to ignore the crawling sensation that had begun to accompany the itching. Walter dreamed of Martha that night. She was in their garden again, but instead of flowers, she was tending to small red growths that emerged from the soil like grotesque mushrooms. "You need to pull them out by the roots," she told him, her voice oddly distant. "Otherwise, they'll just keep growing." He woke, gasping, his nightshirt damp with sweat despite the chill in the apartment. The thermostat was set at 65 to save on heating costs, but his skin felt fevered. Walter stumbled to the kitchen and fumbled 2 aspirin into his palm, swallowing them dry. The bumps now covered most of his right side, from forearm to shoulder and across his chest. Some had begun to appear on his neck. Something was very wrong, but what could he do? A trip to the emergency room would cost hundreds, maybe thousands, money he simply didn't have. And what if it was nothing serious? The shame of overreacting, of being that stereotypical elderly person who made mountains of medical molehills, was almost as unbearable as the physical discomfort. So Walter did what he'd always done in the face of adversity. He endured. He applied more cream. He took more Benadryl. He wore long sleeves and high collars to hide the evidence of his body's rebellion, and he waited for it to pass, just as he'd waited out grief after Martha's death, just as he'd waited out pain after injuries on construction sites, just as he'd waited out the nightmares after Vietnam. But this time, waiting would prove to be a mistake, perhaps the most costly one of his long, proud life. Sarah Thompson arrived unannounced on a Friday afternoon, rolling her carry-on suitcase up the cracked sidewalk to her father's apartment building. She hadn't told Walter she was coming, partly because she wanted to surprise him for his birthday, and partly because she feared he might invent a reason why she shouldn't visit. Their relationship had developed a careful choreography over the years. Weekly phone calls filled with superficial updates, occasional visits marked by what remained unsaid, and a mutual pretense that everything was fine. The lobby of the apartment complex smelled of disinfectant and old carpet. Sarah nodded to an elderly woman sorting through her mail, then climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, refusing to trust the temperamental elevator her father had complained about. Outside Unit 3012, she paused to smooth her blazer and rehearse her smile. She'd come directly from a client meeting, still dressed in her corporate armor, a navy suit that projected confidence she didn't entirely feel. When Walter opened the door, Sarah's practiced smile faltered. Her father had always been lean, but now he looked gaunt, his clothes hanging loosely from his frame. His complexion had a grayish undertone, and the shadows beneath his eyes suggested prolonged sleep deprivation. Most alarming was the way he held himself, slightly hunched, as if his body had become a burden rather than a vehicle. "Sarah?" Surprise and something else. Was it alarm? Flashed across his features before he composed himself. "What are you doing here, sweetheart?" "Happy early birthday," she said, stepping forward to embrace him. Walter returned the hug stiffly, keeping space between them. "I thought I'd surprise you. Take you out for dinner, maybe catch up properly instead of our speed dating phone calls." Walter ushered her inside, subtly adjusting the collar of his flannel shirt as he did so. The apartment was neat, but Spartan. Functional furniture, minimal decorations, nothing that required significant upkeep. Sarah noticed the thermostat read 65 degrees despite the autumn chill. "You should have called," Walter said, his tone gentle but admonishing. "I would have cleaned up a bit." "The place looks fine, Dad," Sarah replied, setting down her suitcase. "It's you I'm worried about. You look like you've lost weight." Walter waved away her concern. "At my age, losing a few pounds is a blessing, not a worry. Coffee? I just made a fresh pot." In the small kitchen, Sarah watched her father's hands tremble slightly as he poured coffee into 2 mugs, one bearing the logo of his old construction company, the other a souvenir from Yellowstone where they'd vacationed as a family decades ago. The ordinary domesticity of the moment almost disguised the wrongness she sensed. "So," Walter said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. "How's work? That big presentation go well?" "It did," Sarah answered, studying him over the rim of her mug. "But I didn't fly out here to talk about marketing strategies. I came to see you, Dad. Really see you. And something's not right." Walter's eyes flickered downward, a tell Sarah had recognized since childhood. He was about to lie, or at least omit critical information. "Just tired lately, not sleeping well. The neighbor's dog." "Dad," Sarah's voice was firm. "Roll up your sleeve." Walter froze. "What?" "I saw you wince when I hugged you, and you keep adjusting your collar like something's bothering you under there. So either you show me what's wrong, or I'm calling Dr. Mitchell right now." Father and daughter locked eyes in a silent standoff, a battle of wills that Sarah recognized from countless childhood confrontations over broken curfews and incomplete homework. But this wasn't about teenage rebellion or parental authority. This was about life and death, though Sarah wouldn't understand the full extent of that reality until much later. Finally, Walter sighed and slowly unbuttoned his left cuff. He rolled the sleeve up past his elbow, his movements deliberate, as if he were disarming a bomb. Sarah gasped at the sight of his forearm, covered in angry red bumps. Some appeared to be healing, but others were inflamed with disturbing central depressions. "My God, Dad, how long has this been going on?" "A couple weeks," Walter admitted. "Started as just a few spots. Thought it was an allergic reaction." Sarah reached for his arm but stopped short of touching it. "Have you seen a doctor?" "It's just a rash, Sarah." "It'll clear up." "This is not just a rash," Sarah insisted, pushing back her chair. "This looks infected. You need medical attention." "Do you have any idea what an emergency room visit costs these days?" Walter's voice took on an edge. "Even with Medicare, the co-pays, the medications—" "I don't care what it costs," Sarah interrupted. "This is your health we're talking about." "Well, I care," Walter replied, rolling down his sleeve. "I didn't work 40 years just to throw money away on every little—" "Show me the rest." Walter blinked. "What? You said it started on your arm. Where else is it now?" And don't bother lying. I can see it on your neck." The defeat in Walter's eyes told Sarah everything. Wordlessly, he unbuttoned his shirt to reveal a torso mottled with the same red bumps, some now larger and more developed. The worst were on his shoulder and chest, where clusters of the lesions had formed patterns that reminded Sarah, with a chill, of insect colonies. "We're going to the doctor," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "Now." 90 minutes later, they sat in a cramped examination room at the Millfield Community Health Clinic, the only facility within walking distance that accepted Medicare patients without an appointment. The room smelled of disinfectant and the faint undertone of desperation that seemed to permeate all low-income medical facilities. Dr. Peterson couldn't have been more than 30, with a carefully groomed beard that seemed designed to add years to his youthful face. He examined Walter's skin with a cursory glance, pressing a gloved finger against one of the bumps and noting Walter's wince. "How long have you had this rash, Mr. Thompson?" "About 2 weeks," Walter answered before Sarah could correct him. Dr. Peterson nodded, already typing notes into a tablet. "Any new soaps, detergents, or foods in your diet?" "No." "Any fever, chills, or fatigue?" Walter hesitated. "Some trouble sleeping." "Dad," Sarah interjected, "tell him about the fever." Walter shot her an irritated look. "Maybe a low-grade fever. Nothing serious." Dr. Peterson continued his examination, spending less than 3 minutes actually looking at the affected areas before stepping back. "It appears to be a form of folliculitis, an infection of the hair follicles, common in older adults due to thinning skin and compromised immune function." "Those don't look like infected hair follicles to me," Sarah said, struggling to keep her tone respectful. "Some of them have holes in the center." "Those are pustules that have ruptured," Dr. Peterson explained with the slightly condescending patience of someone used to explaining medical concepts to lay people. "I'm going to prescribe a topical antibiotic cream and a course of oral antibiotics. If it doesn't improve in a week, you might want to see a dermatologist." "A week?" Sarah echoed incredulously. "This has already been going on for 2 weeks. Shouldn't he see a specialist now?" Dr. Peterson's smile tightened. "Ms. Thompson, folliculitis is extremely common. The treatments I'm prescribing are the standard first line of defense. Most cases resolve without specialist intervention." "But, Sarah," Walter cut in, "the doctor knows what he's talking about. Let's just get the prescriptions and go." Dr. Peterson wrote the prescriptions with efficient strokes and handed them to Walter. "Apply the cream 3 times daily and take the antibiotic with food. Keep the areas clean and dry. Avoid tight clothing." As they left the clinic, prescription slips in hand, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been rushed through an assembly line rather than given proper medical attention. At the pharmacy counter inside the nearby Walgreens, the reality of Walter's financial situation became painfully clear. "That'll be 42.50 c's for the cream and 76.75 for the antibiotics," the pharmacist announced after processing the insurance. Walter's face paled slightly. "The antibiotics aren't covered?" "They're covered partially," the pharmacist explained. "Your copay is $76.75. Sarah watched her father's internal calculations, a humiliating arithmetic of necessity versus cost. Before he could speak, she pulled out her credit card. "We'll take both." In the car, Walter stared straight ahead, his profile a study in stoic dignity despite the circumstances. "You didn't need to do that." "Yes, I did," Sarah replied, navigating through the early evening traffic. "And we need to talk about this, Dad, about your finances, your health, your—" "There's nothing to talk about," Walter interrupted. "I had a medical issue. I got it checked. End of story." "This isn't the end of anything," Sarah countered. "This is just the beginning of us having an honest conversation about your situation." Walter remained silent as they pulled up to his apartment building. Inside, Sarah prepared a simple dinner while her father took his first dose of antibiotics. The evening passed with careful conversation about safe topics, a documentary Walter had watched, Sarah's condo renovation, the unseasonably warm weather, the unspoken tension hung between them like an invisible wall. The next morning, Sarah woke early and made coffee, planning her approach. She needed to extend her stay, to make sure the medications were working, to perhaps broach the subject of Walter moving closer to Chicago. But when she checked on her father, she found him dressed in his usual flannel shirt and khakis, stubborn determination etched on his face. "I appreciate the visit, sweetheart, but I know you need to get back," he said. "You've got your presentation, your appointments. I can stay a few more days," Sarah insisted. "I want to make sure the antibiotics are working." "I'm a grown man, Sarah. I've been taking medication without supervision for longer than you've been alive." His tone was light but firm. "Besides, Eleanor next door checks on me regularly. I'm not completely alone out here." The argument continued over breakfast, but Sarah recognized the immovable object that was her father's pride. By noon, she found herself reluctantly packing her suitcase, extracting promises from Walter to take all his medication, to call if the condition worsened, to let her know if he needed anything, financial or otherwise. "I'll be fine," Walter assured her at the door, embracing her with slightly less reservation than when she'd arrived. "The medicine's already helping. See?" He rolled up his sleeve to show her arm, and indeed some of the smaller bumps seemed less inflamed. What Walter didn't show her were the new bumps forming on his back, or the ones on his thigh that had begun to throb with a strange rhythmic sensation. What he didn't tell her was that he'd spent the previous night in the bathroom, biting down on a washcloth to muffle his groans as waves of pain radiated from the largest lesions. After Sarah's car disappeared down the street, Walter returned to his empty apartment and carefully locked the door. He went to the bathroom, removed his shirt, and examined his reflection in the mirror. The sight that greeted him confirmed what he already knew. Dr. Peterson was wrong. This wasn't folliculitis. This was something much worse. And he was completely alone with it once again. 3 days after Sarah's departure, Walter woke to sheets soaked with sweat and something else, a sticky wetness that when he turned on the lamp revealed itself to be tinged with pink. The antibiotics, far from improving his condition, seemed to have accelerated it. The bumps had grown larger, their centers more pronounced, and the throbbing beneath his skin had become a constant companion, like an unwelcome heartbeat in places where no pulse should exist. Walter sat on the edge of the bed, light-headed from the simple effort of rising. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m., the digits glowing accusingly in the darkness. He'd promised Sarah he would call if things worsened, but what good would a phone call do now, in the middle of the night? And what could she do from Chicago that wouldn't involve upending her life for his mistakes? He shuffled to the bathroom, each step an exercise in managing pain. The fluorescent light flickered twice before steadying, casting a harsh glow that transformed his reflection into something out of a horror film. Walter hardly recognized himself. His eyes were sunken, cheeks hollow, skin sallow, except for the angry red eruptions that now spread across most of his torso and had begun to appear on his legs. "Just need to stick with the medication," he muttered, voice raspy from sleep and dehydration. "Give it time to work." But even as he said it, Walter knew he was lying to himself. Whatever this was, it was beyond the reach of generic antibiotics and over-the-counter creams. One of the larger bumps on his shoulder had developed a small, dark center that seemed to pulsate independently of his heartbeat. He leaned closer to the mirror, squinting to compensate for his aging eyesight. Was that movement? A trick of the light, surely, or his exhausted mind playing tricks after too many nights of interrupted sleep. Walter reached for the tube of antibiotic cream, his hands trembling as he applied it to the worst spots. The cool gel provided momentary relief that quickly gave way to a burning sensation. Back in bed, Walter stared at the ceiling, tracing the familiar crack that ran from the light fixture to the far corner. How many nights had he lain awake like this after Martha died? How many mornings had he woken up and, for just a moment, reached across the bed for someone who was no longer there? Grief and illness shared this quality. They reduced the world to the narrow dimensions of personal suffering, making it impossible to see beyond the next moment of pain. He must have drifted off, because the next thing Walter knew, sunlight was streaming through the thin curtains, and someone was knocking at his door. He struggled to his feet, pulled on a robe to cover the worst of his condition, and made his way unsteadily to the entrance. Eleanor Jenkins stood in the hallway, a covered dish in her hands and concern etched on her lined face. At 72, Eleanor maintained the energetic demeanor of someone a decade younger, her silver hair always neatly styled, her clothes pressed and coordinated. Today she wore a floral blouse and navy slacks, looking more prepared for a luncheon than a visit to a neighbor's apartment. "Walter Thompson, were you planning to sleep all day?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp as they took in his disheveled appearance. "I brought chicken soup, homemade, not that sodium-laden canned stuff." Walter hesitated, one hand holding the door while the other clutched his robe closed at the neck. "That's very kind, Eleanor, but I'm not feeling up to company right now." Eleanor's expression softened. "Which is precisely why you need it. And soup." "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Before Walter could formulate an excuse, Eleanor had somehow maneuvered past him into the apartment, heading straight for the kitchen as if she owned the place. This was her way, a benevolent invasion that brooked no resistance. Usually Walter found it equally irritating and endearing. Today, it filled him with dread. "Your daughter called me," Eleanor announced as she set the soup container on the counter and began opening cupboards in search of bowls. "Asked me to check on you. Said you'd been ill." Walter stiffened. Sarah had no right. "She had every right," Eleanor interrupted, finding bowls and setting them on the counter with more force than necessary. "She's worried sick about you, and from the looks of things, she has reason to be." "It's just a skin infection," Walter said, leaning against the doorframe for support. "Doctor gave me antibiotics." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her hands on her hips. "Walter Thompson, I was a nurse for 42 years before I retired. I worked in the county hospital's emergency department for most of that time. I've seen everything from radiation burns to tropical parasites, and I know when someone is downplaying their condition." Walter felt a chill at the word parasites, but maintained his facade of casual indifference. "Didn't know you were a nurse." "There's a lot you don't know about me," Eleanor replied, ladling soup into the bowls, "just as there's apparently a lot your daughter doesn't know about what's really going on with you." She gestured to the small kitchen table. "Sit, eat, then we'll talk about what's really happening under that robe." Too weak to argue, Walter sank into a chair while Eleanor placed a steaming bowl before him. The aroma of chicken, herbs, and vegetables would normally have been appetizing, but now it turned his stomach. Still, he obediently lifted a spoonful to his lips, if only to appease his determined neighbor. Eleanor watched him eat with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to monitoring patients. "When did the rash first appear?" Walter swallowed with difficulty. "Few weeks ago. Started on my arm." "And when did the pustules begin forming central openings?" Walter's spoon clattered against the bowl. "How did you—" "I told you, I was a nurse," Eleanor said calmly. "And I've been watching you favor your right side when you walk, adjust your clothing to avoid contact with your skin, and flinch when anything touches your shoulder. Classic signs of something more serious than a simple rash." Walter stared into his soup, suddenly finding the floating carrots fascinating. "It's under control." "Is it?" Eleanor's voice was gentle now, the professional concern of her former career softening her usual directness. "Because I heard you crying out in your sleep last night through the wall we share. And you look like you've lost 10 pounds since I saw you last week. That's not under control, Walter. Something in her tone, not pity, but genuine concern mixed with professional assessment, broke through Walter's carefully constructed defenses. His shoulders sagged, the facade crumbling like an old brick wall, finally surrendering to time and elements. "It's getting worse," he admitted, the words barely audible. "The antibiotics aren't working, and there's something strange about these bumps." Eleanor nodded, as if she'd expected this confession. "Show me." In the bathroom, Walter reluctantly removed his robe, keeping his back to Eleanor, at first out of modesty, a quaint concern given the circumstances. He heard her sharp intake of breath when he finally turned to face her. "Oh, Walter," she murmured, professional detachment momentarily giving way to human reaction. "How long have they been like this?" "The worst ones, maybe 4 or 5 days," Walter answered, staring at the tile floor rather than meeting her gaze. "Started getting the dark centers a couple days ago." Eleanor leaned closer, examining one of the larger lesions on his shoulder. Her face was inches from his skin, eyes narrowed in concentration. "These aren't typical pustules. The formation is all wrong, and the central opening looks almost like—" She stopped abruptly, straightening up. "Walter, we need to get you to a hospital. Not the clinic. A real hospital with infectious disease specialists. I can't afford—" "This isn't about money," Eleanor cut him off sharply. "This is about your life. These lesions are showing signs of myiasis." What? Myiasis. It's a condition where fly larvae, maggots, develop under the skin. She held up a hand as Walter's expression transformed from confusion to horror. "I'm not saying that's definitely what this is, but it presents similarly. And if I'm right, those antibiotics aren't just ineffective, they're irrelevant." Walter felt the room tilt slightly, his vision tunneling at the edges. The idea of insects growing inside him was too grotesque to contemplate, too far removed from the ordinary medical concerns of aging that he'd prepared himself to face. That's not possible," he stammered. "I haven't been anywhere tropical, never left the country except for Vietnam, and that was 40 years ago." Eleanor helped him back into his robe, her movements efficient but gentle. "There are domestic species that can cause similar conditions. Or you could have come in contact with something imported. What matters now is getting you proper treatment." "I'll call Sarah," Walter said weakly. "She'll know what to do." "We'll call her from the car," Eleanor replied, already moving toward the bedroom. "Where are your clothes?" "You need something loose-fitting." Walter sank onto the closed toilet lid, suddenly overwhelmed by the rapid shift from solitary suffering to emergency intervention. "Eleanor, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm telling." Eleanor reappeared with a pair of loose sweatpants and a button-up shirt. "This isn't a favor, Walter. This is what neighbors do, what humans do for each other. Now, can you dress yourself or do you need help?" Pride, that faithful companion that had sustained and isolated him for so long, finally surrendered to necessity. "I might need some help with the shirt," he admitted. As Eleanor helped him navigate the painful process of dressing, Walter's mind drifted to the past, to construction sites where he'd helped injured workers, to nights when he'd held Martha through the worst of her chemo sickness, to times when he'd been the strong one, the helper rather than the helped. How had he arrived at this reversal? When had he crossed the invisible threshold from provider to dependent? "Stop that," Eleanor said sharply, interrupting his thoughts. "Stop what?" "That look. I know it well. The 'how did I get here' face. The 'I used to be strong' face." She buttoned his shirt with efficient movements. "I saw it on my Harold's face when cancer took his dignity before it took his life. I've seen it on countless patients' faces. And let me tell you what I told them. Accepting help isn't weakness. It's just your turn to receive instead of give." Walter blinked rapidly, surprised by the sudden moisture in his eyes. "You sound like Martha." Eleanor smiled, the expression softening the practical lines of her face. "I'll take that as a compliment. Now, let's get you to the car." The journey down the 3 flights of stairs was an exercise in endurance. Each step sent jolts of pain through Walter's body, the lesions seeming to throb in angry protest at the movement. By the time they reached Eleanor's sensible Buick in the parking lot, Walter was sweating profusely, despite the cool autumn air. "County General or St. Luke's?" Eleanor asked, as she helped him into the passenger seat. "Whichever's cheaper," Walter answered automatically. Eleanor gave him a look that would have withered a less miserable man. "County General it is. Better infectious disease department anyway." As they drove, Eleanor maintained a steady stream of conversation, part distraction and part information gathering. She asked about his symptoms in chronological order, his medical history, his medications, his allergies. All the questions a triage nurse would ask, delivered with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. Walter answered mechanically, his mind increasingly foggy as fever took firmer hold. Between responses, he stared out the window at the passing town, the hardware store where he still occasionally bought supplies for small repairs, the park where he played chess, the diner where he sometimes treated himself to breakfast when his Social Security check arrived. How strange that these ordinary places continued to exist while his body became a battleground for some unknown invader. "I'm going to lose my apartment," he said suddenly, the non sequitur hanging in the air between them. Eleanor glanced at him, concern deepening the lines around her eyes. "What makes you say that?" "Can't work. Can't pay rent if I'm hospitalized. Medicare won't cover everything. I'll lose everything." The words tumbled out, giving voice to the fears that had kept him from seeking help sooner. "One crisis at a time, Walter," Eleanor replied, her tone firm but kind. "First, we get you well. Then we figure out the rest." "Easy for you to say," Walter muttered. "You own your condo outright." "Yes, and I had to sell my house and most of my possessions to afford it after Harold's medical bills," Eleanor countered. "I know exactly what you're facing, Walter. I've been there." This silenced him. In all their casual interactions over the past 3 years, Eleanor had never mentioned financial hardship. She had always seemed so put together, so secure. The revelation that she, too, had faced the crushing weight of America's healthcare system created an unexpected bond between them. As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Walter felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. The world tilted alarmingly, colors smearing like wet paint. He was vaguely aware of Eleanor's voice rising in alarm, of her hand on his forehead, of the car accelerating toward the emergency entrance. Then darkness claimed him, bringing temporary relief from the horror growing beneath his skin. Walter drifted in and out of consciousness as he was transferred from Eleanor's car to a wheelchair, then to a gurney. Fragments of conversation reached him through the fog of fever. Multiple lesions across torso, arms, and legs. Temperature 103.8. Possible parasitic infection. Need infectious disease, consult stat. A cool hand on his forehead, the sharp sting of an IV needle, the mechanical beep of monitors. These sensations anchored him briefly to reality before the tide of fever pulled him under again. In his delirium, Walter moved between past and present. He was 22 again, trudging through the humid Vietnamese jungle, the weight of his pack pulling at his shoulders. He was 40, standing on the skeletal framework of a half-constructed house, the satisfaction of creation filling his chest. He was 55, holding Martha's hand as she slipped away, her once vibrant presence fading like a sunset. And always, returning to the present, he was aware of the crawling, burrowing sensation beneath his skin. the undeniable feeling that something was alive inside him, feeding on his flesh, growing stronger as he grew weaker. "Mr. Thompson, can you hear me?" A voice cut through the fog, authoritative, professional, but tinged with genuine concern. Walter forced his eyes open to find a woman in a white coat leaning over him, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her expression serious. "I'm Dr. Blackwell, infectious disease specialist," she continued when she saw his eyes focus. "You're at County General Hospital. Do you understand where you are?" Walter tried to nod, but the movement sent pain shooting through his neck where one of the lesions had formed. "Yes," he managed to croak. "Good. We're going to take care of you, but I need to examine these lesions more closely." "Is that all right?" Again, Walter tried to respond affirmatively, but his tongue felt swollen and uncooperative. Dr. Blackwell seemed to take his silence as consent, and began carefully examining the affected areas, her gloved hands gentle but thorough. "Mr. Thompson, these appear to be myiasis lesions, specifically human botfly larvae," she explained, her clinical tone failing to disguise the gravity of the diagnosis. "It's extremely rare in this part of the country, which is why it was likely misdiagnosed initially. We need to remove the larvae and treat the surrounding infections. Do I have your permission to proceed?" Walter processed the information slowly, his fever-addled brain struggling to grasp the full implications. Larvae. Living creatures, growing inside him. The stuff of nightmares made flesh. His flesh. "How?" he finally managed. "We'll surgically extract them under local anesthesia," Dr. Blackwell explained. "It's a relatively straightforward procedure, but given the number of lesions and your current condition, we'll need to admit you for monitoring and intravenous antibiotics afterward." Walter closed his eyes briefly, knowing what this meant. Days in the hospital, thousands in bills, perhaps the end of his independence, but what choice did he have? "Do it," he whispered. As Dr. Blackwell prepared to leave, Walter summoned the strength to ask one more question. "How? How did this happen?" The doctor paused, her expression softening slightly. Botfly eggs are typically transferred through mosquito bites or contact with contaminated materials. Have you received any items from tropical regions recently? Or been in contact with someone who traveled to Central or South America? Walter's mind, despite its feverish state, suddenly latched onto a memory. Sarah's last visit before this one, months ago. The small wooden statue she'd brought him from a business trip to Brazil. "A gift," he murmured. "From the Amazon. My daughter." Dr. Blackwell nodded, making a note in his chart. "That would explain it. The larvae could have been in the wood. It's rare, but it happens. We'll need to contact your daughter for more information." "She doesn't know," Walter insisted, sudden energy flooding him, "about any of this. Don't tell her how bad—" "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Blackwell interrupted gently, "your neighbor informed us that your daughter is your emergency contact. We're legally obligated to notify her of your condition." The thought of Sarah seeing him like this, weak, infected, hosting parasites, was almost worse than the condition itself. Walter turned his face away, unable to bear the humiliation that awaited him. "She's busy," he said weakly. "Important job. Don't bother her." Dr. Blackwell's hand rested briefly on his unaffected shoulder. "Family is never a bother, Mr. Thompson. Now try to rest while we prepare for the procedure." Left alone with the steady beep of monitors and the crawling sensation beneath his skin, Walter Thompson, who had built houses that withstood decades of storms, who had survived jungle warfare and the loss of his beloved wife, who had prided himself on never asking for help, finally surrendered to tears. The extraction room was clinically bright. the overhead lights reflecting off metal surfaces with an unforgiving clarity that seemed designed to eliminate shadows and secrets. Walter lay on his side on the narrow table, a sheet draped over his lower body, his exposed torso mapped with surgical markers indicating each lesion to be treated. The local anesthetic had dulled the pain to a distant pressure, but nothing could numb the psychological horror of knowing what was about to emerge from his body. Dr. Blackwell stood beside him, her face partially obscured by a surgical mask, her eyes focused and calm above it. Beside her, a young resident named Dr. Chen arranged instruments on a metal tray with methodical precision. A nurse monitored Walter's vitals, the soft beeping of machines providing a rhythmic counterpoint to the tension in the room. "We're going to start with the most developed lesion on your shoulder," Dr. Blackwell explained, her voice steady. "You'll feel some pressure but no pain. If that changes, tell me immediately." Walter nodded, unable to trust his voice. He fixed his gaze on a small crack in the ceiling tile, trying to detach his mind from what was happening to his body. The procedure began with Dr. Blackwell applying a clear gel around the largest lesion. "This petroleum jelly creates a seal that will force the larva to emerge for air," she explained, her clinical tone somehow reassuring in its detachment. Walter felt the gentle pressure of instruments against his skin, followed by a strange sensation, not quite pain, but a disturbing movement, as if something inside him was responding to the doctor's ministrations. He closed his eyes, unwilling to witness what came next. "There," Dr. Blackwell said after a moment. "First one's out." Despite his determination not to look, Walter's curiosity betrayed him. He opened his eyes and glanced toward the small specimen container that Dr. Chen was holding. Inside was a pale, segmented creature about the size of a small grape, with tiny, dark hooks at one end. It wriggled slightly in the container, very much alive. Walter turned away quickly, bile rising in his throat. "How many more?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a momentary pause before Dr. Blackwell answered, "We've identified 27 distinct lesions that appear to contain viable larvae." 27. The number hung in the air like a sentence. 27 living creatures that had been growing inside him while he ignored the signs, while he let pride and fear keep him from seeking help. "Jesus Christ," Walter murmured, the rare profanity escaping before he could stop it. "The good news," Dr. Blackwell continued, already moving to the next lesion, "is that once removed and with proper antibiotic treatment, you should recover fully. The human botfly doesn't typically cause long-term damage unless secondary infections develop." The extraction process continued methodically, each removal following the same pattern: application of the petroleum jelly, gentle manipulation of the surrounding tissue, the disturbing sensation of movement, and then the relief of extraction. Walter drifted in and out of full awareness, his mind seeking refuge from the reality of his situation. He thought of Martha, wondering what she would say if she could see him now. Probably some combination of sympathy and exasperation. "Oh, Walter, why didn't you get help sooner?" He thought of Sarah, imagining her horror when she learned what had happened, the guilt she might feel over the unwitting gift that had caused this nightmare. He even thought of Eleanor, grateful for her intrusion into his isolated suffering. "Mr. Thompson?" Dr. Blackwell's voice pulled him back to the present. "We're almost finished with this session." "How are you doing?" Walter realized he'd been holding his breath and exhaled slowly. "Still here," he answered, attempting a weak smile that no one could see behind his surgical mask. "We've removed 16 larvae so far," Dr. Blackwell informed him. "Some of the lesions weren't as developed as we initially thought. We'll need to do another session tomorrow for the remaining ones after you've had some time to rest." 16 down, 11 to go. Walter tried to find comfort in the mathematics of his condition, the quantifiable reduction in horror, the countable steps toward recovery. As the team finished bandaging the treated areas, Dr. Blackwell peeled off her gloves and moved to face Walter directly. "You've done very well," she said, her eyes crinkling slightly at the corners in what he assumed was a smile beneath her mask. "We're going to move you to a recovery room now. Your daughter has been notified and is on her way." Walter felt a complicated surge of emotions, relief at the thought of seeing Sarah, shame at the circumstances, fear of her reaction. "How much did you tell her?" "The basics," Dr. Blackwell replied. "That you're being treated for a parasitic infection that requires surgical intervention. The details will be better coming from me in person, with you present, if you wish." Walter nodded gratefully. At least he would be somewhat more presentable when Sarah arrived, the visible evidence of his infestation now sealed in specimen containers in the laboratory rather than protruding from his skin. The recovery room was private, a small mercy that Walter attributed to the unusual nature of his condition rather than any financial consideration. The bed was more comfortable than the examination table, and someone had thought to provide an extra blanket, which he clutched around his shoulders despite the fever that still lingered. Eleanor was waiting for him, sitting in the visitor's chair with a paperback book open on her lap. She closed it when he was wheeled in, her expression a carefully controlled mix of concern and encouragement. "They let you stay?" Walter asked as the orderlies transferred him to the bed. "I told them I was your sister," Eleanor replied with a small shrug. "At our age, they don't look too closely at the resemblance." Despite everything, Walter found himself chuckling, a dry, weak sound, but genuine. Bold move for a former medical professional. "Rules are meant to be broken when they're stupid," Eleanor said matter-of-factly. "How are you feeling?" Walter considered the question. The anesthetic was wearing off, and pain was returning to the extraction sites. His body felt like a battlefield, territories won and lost, wounds inflicted in the name of healing. "Like I've been hollowed out," he finally answered. Eleanor nodded, as if this were a perfectly reasonable response. "They showed me one of them. Nasty little things." "You asked to see them?" Walter couldn't hide his horror. "Of course I did. Know your enemy, that's what my herald always said." She leaned forward slightly. "Sarah called while you were in the procedure room. She's on the last flight out tonight. Should be here by midnight." Walter closed his eyes briefly. She shouldn't have to deal with this. "Parents," Eleanor sighed with exaggerated patience, "always thinking they stop being parents when their children grow up. She loves you, Walter. Let her show it." Before Walter could respond, the door opened to admit Dr. Blackwell and a man in a dark suit whose ID badge identified him as Hospital Administration. The administrator's face wore the carefully neutral expression of someone about to deliver unwelcome news. "Mr. Thompson," he began, "I'm Richard Keller, Patient Financial Services Director. I wanted to discuss your situation personally, given the unusual nature of your case." Walter tensed, anticipating the financial blow that was about to fall. "Just give me the bottom line, Mr. Keller. What's this going to cost me?" Keller cleared his throat. "Well, that's what I wanted to discuss. Your Medicare coverage will handle a portion, but given the specialized nature of the treatment and the extended stay we're anticipating, there will be significant out-of-pocket expenses." "How significant?" Walter pressed, his voice stronger than he expected. "Preliminary estimates suggest around $30,000, Keller replied, having the decency to look uncomfortable. "However, we have payment plans available, and in cases of financial hardship—" "I'll sell the apartment," Walter interrupted. "It's not much, but it's paid for." "Walter, no," Eleanor interjected. "That's your home." "What choice do I have?" Walter asked, the resignation in his voice painful to hear. I'm not going to saddle Sarah with this debt. She has her own life, her own expenses. Dr. Blackwell, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. Mr. Thompson, before you make any decisions, you should know that we've submitted your case to the Centers for Disease Control as an unusual instance of imported myiasis. There's a possibility that some of your expenses may be covered by research grants or public health funds. Hope flickered briefly in Walter's chest, then died. He'd been around long enough to know that bureaucratic possibilities rarely materialized into actual assistance. Don't sell the apartment yet was hardly a financial plan he could count on. I appreciate the thought, Doctor, he said, but I've learned not to count on maybes. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway, raised voices, hurried footsteps, and then the door bursting open to admit a disheveled Sarah Thompson, still wearing her business suit from earlier in the day, her carry-on suitcase clutched in one hand. "Dad!" she exclaimed, dropping the suitcase and rushing to his bedside. "What happened? They wouldn't tell me anything specific on the phone, just that you were hospitalized with some kind of parasitic infection." Walter was struck by how pale Sarah looked, how thin her face had become since he'd last seen her. Had she lost weight, or had he simply failed to notice before? "It's not as bad as it sounds," he lied, attempting a reassuring smile. Sarah turned to Dr. Blackwell, clearly recognizing her as the authority in the room. "What's wrong with my father? The complete truth, please." Dr. Blackwell glanced at Walter, silently asking permission. He nodded slightly, resigned to the revelation. "Your father is suffering from cutaneous myiasis, specifically human botfly larvae infestation," Dr. Blackwell explained, her tone professional but compassionate. "We've removed 16 larvae so far, with approximately 11 more to extract tomorrow. He's also being treated for secondary bacterial infections and dehydration." Sarah's face drained of what little color remained. "Larvae, as in insect larvae, growing inside him?" "I'm afraid so," Dr. Blackwell confirmed. "It's extremely rare in the United States, typically only seen in travelers returning from Central or South America." Sarah sank into the chair beside Eleanor, who had risen to give her space. "But Dad hasn't traveled anywhere. He barely leaves Millfield." Here it was, the moment Walter had dreaded. He cleared his throat. "The wooden statue, Sarah." "The one you brought me from your business trip to Brazil last spring. Dr. Blackwell thinks that might have been the source." The horror that bloomed on Sarah's face was worse than Walter had imagined. "The statue? The little carved jaguar? I gave you that infection?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "You couldn't have known," Walter said quickly. "It's not your fault." Sarah's expression shifted from horror to confusion, then to anger. "But these larvae, they take time to develop, don't they, Doctor? This didn't just happen overnight." "Correct," Dr. Blackwell nodded. "The life cycle from egg to mature larva is typically around 6 to 8 weeks. So you've been suffering with this for, what, weeks? Months?" Sarah's gaze turned back to Walter, accusing now. "And you didn't tell me? You didn't get help?" "I thought it was just a rash at first," Walter defended weakly. By the time I realized it was something worse, By the time he realized it was something worse, he was too stubborn to ask for help, Eleanor interjected bluntly. And too worried about the cost. Sarah's eyes widened. "The cost? You let parasites grow inside you because of money?" The stark phrasing made Walter wince. "It sounds foolish when you put it that way." "Because it is foolish." Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing the small room in agitation. "Dad, I have a successful career. I could have helped with medical expenses. I would have insisted on it." "You have your own life, your own expenses," Walter repeated his earlier words. I'm not going to be a burden to you." Sarah stopped pacing, her expression softening into something more painful than anger, disappointment perhaps, or profound sadness. "Is that what you think you'd be? A burden?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Years of careful distance, of mutual protection that had somehow morphed into mutual isolation. Walter suddenly saw with painful clarity how his pride had not only endangered his health, but had also built a wall between him and his only child. Mr. Keller, who had been standing uncomfortably near the door during this family drama, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should discuss the financial aspects at another time," he suggested, already backing toward the exit. Sarah turned to him, her expression sharpening. "No, let's discuss them now. I'm Sarah Thompson, Mr. Thompson's daughter and financial guarantor. Whatever my father needs, he'll get. Send all bills to me." "Sarah, no," Walter protested. "You can't." "I can and I will," Sarah cut him off. "And we'll discuss this later when you're better and we can have a real conversation about what it means to be family." The determination in her voice reminded Walter so much of Martha that for a moment he couldn't speak. Martha had had that same tone when facing down challenges, a tone that brooked no argument, that turned opinions into facts through sheer force of will. Dr. Blackwell, sensing the need to redirect the emotional tension, stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson needs rest now. We'll continue treatment in the morning. Ms. Thompson, you're welcome to stay, but I'd suggest getting some rest yourself. Tomorrow will be another long day." Sarah nodded, her professional composure returning gradually. "I'll stay. Is there a cot or recliner available?" "I'll have one brought in," Dr. Blackwell promised. "And Mrs." She paused, looking at Eleanor. "Jenkins," Eleanor supplied. "And I'm not actually his sister, in case that wasn't obvious from the family drama you just witnessed." Dr. Blackwell's lips twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. "Mrs. Jenkins, visiting hours technically ended at 8, but given the circumstances, you're welcome to stay a bit longer." Eleanor rose, gathering her purse and book. "Actually, I think these two need some time alone. I'll be back tomorrow, Walter." She patted his hand gently. "Try not to be too stubborn while I'm gone." After Eleanor, Dr. Blackwell, and Mr. Keller had left, Walter and Sarah were alone in the room, the silence between them punctuated only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. Sarah had moved to the window and stood with her back to him, staring out at the hospital parking lot illuminated by sodium lights. "I'm sorry," Walter finally said, the words inadequate but necessary. "For not telling you. For letting it get this bad." Sarah turned, and Walter was startled to see tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "Why, Dad? Why do this to yourself?" The question contained multitudes. Why suffer alone? Why refuse help? Why value pride over health? Why push away the only family you have left? "I don't know," Walter answered honestly. "After your mother died, after I lost the house, something in me broke. The thought of asking for help, of being dependent, it felt like losing the last piece of myself I recognized." Sarah moved back to his bedside, taking his hand in hers. Her fingers were cool against his fever-warm skin. "But that's not how family works. That's not how love works." "I know that. In theory," Walter admitted. "It's the practice I've struggled with." Sarah studied him, really looked at him perhaps for the first time in years, taking in the lines of his face, the gray of his hair, the vulnerability that illness had forced upon him. "We haven't been honest with each other for a long time, have we?" Walter felt something shift between them, a door opening where a wall had stood. "No," he agreed. "We haven't." Sarah took a deep breath as if preparing to dive into deep water. "Then let me start now. I have breast cancer, Dad. Stage 2. That's why I've been having appointments. I couldn't reschedule. That's why I couldn't stay longer when I visited. I'm halfway through chemotherapy." The words hit Walter like physical blows. His daughter, his beautiful, strong, independent daughter, was fighting the same disease that had taken Martha, and she'd been fighting it alone, just as he had been fighting his own battle alone. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking, "why didn't you tell me?" A sad smile touched her lips. "Why didn't you tell me about the parasites?" "Same reason. I didn't want to be a burden." The irony was almost too much to bear. Walter felt tears burning behind his eyes for the second time that day, decades of stoicism crumbling in the face of this shared revelation. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" he managed, squeezing her hand. "The Thompson stubbornness," Sarah agreed, wiping her own tears with her free hand. "Mom always said it would be the death of us both." "Not today," Walter said with sudden fierceness. "Not from this." And in that moment, as father and daughter held hands in a sterile hospital room, surrounded by the evidence of their mutual suffering and their shared stubborn pride, something new began to grow between them. Not parasites feeding on flesh, but understanding feeding on truth, slowly replacing what had been hollowed out by years of well-intentioned distance. Walter woke the next morning to find Sarah asleep in the recliner beside his bed, her body awkwardly contorted in a way that would surely leave her with aches upon waking. In sleep, her face had relaxed, revealing the shadows beneath her eyes and the slight hollowing of her cheeks, signs of her own battle that he had failed to notice. The chemotherapy was taking its toll, yet here she was, spending what little energy she had left to care for him. The realization struck him with renewed force. While he had been avoiding doctors over a few $100s, his daughter had been facing mortality alone. While he had been preserving his pride, she had been fighting for her life. The contrast between their situations, his self-inflicted suffering versus her unavoidable illness, filled him with a shame so profound it momentarily eclipsed the physical pain of his condition. A nurse entered quietly, checking the IV and taking Walter's vitals with practiced efficiency. "Temperature's down," she whispered approvingly. 102.1, still high but heading in the right direction. Walter nodded, careful not to disturb Sarah. "What time is the next procedure?" He couldn't bring himself to say larva removal, the words too grotesque for the quiet morning hour. "Dr. Blackwell scheduled it for 10, the nurse replied, noting something on his chart. "She wanted to give you time to rest." Her eyes flicked to Sarah's sleeping form. "Your daughter was here all night, refused to leave even when we brought the recliner. You've raised a stubborn one." Walter's mouth twitched in a half-smile. "She comes by it honestly." After the nurse left, Walter lay watching the slow rise and fall of Sarah's chest, remembering how he used to check on her the same way when she was a child, standing in her doorway, reassuring himself that she was safe, breathing, alive. The role reversal wasn't lost on him. Now she was the one keeping vigil, and he was the vulnerable one needing protection. Sarah stirred, her eyes opening directly to meet his gaze. For a moment they simply looked at each other, father and daughter stripped of pretenses by exhaustion and illness. "Morning," she finally said, her voice rough with sleep. "How are you feeling?" Walter considered lying, then remembered their promise of honesty. "Like I've been run over, set on fire, and then run over again." Sarah sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her neck. "At least your descriptive abilities haven't suffered." She reached for the water pitcher on the bedside table, pouring a cup for herself and one for him. As Walter sipped the cool water, he studied his daughter more carefully in the morning light. "How are you feeling? And I mean, really feeling, not the sanitized version you've been giving me for months." Sarah seemed to consider her answer carefully. Today is a good day, relatively speaking. The nausea usually hits in the afternoon. Fatigue is constant but manageable with enough coffee. She rubbed her right collarbone absently. The port site itches sometimes. That's actually the most annoying part, oddly enough. Port? Walter questioned. Chemotherapy port, Sarah explained, pulling her collar aside slightly to reveal a small bump beneath her skin near her collarbone. They implant it so they don't have to keep finding veins for every treatment. It's connected to a major blood vessel. Walter stared at the visible evidence of her illness, feeling a visceral understanding of what she'd been enduring while he remained oblivious. "I should have been there," he said quietly, "for your treatments." "And I should have been checking on you more carefully," Sarah countered. "We can play the blame game all day, Dad, but it won't change anything. What matters is where we go from here." Before Walter could respond, the door opened to admit Dr. Blackwell, accompanied by a different resident than the day before, a tall, red-haired woman whose ID badge read Dr. Patel. Behind them came an older man in a suit that seemed slightly too large for his thin frame, carrying a leather portfolio. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson, Ms. Thompson," Dr. Blackwell greeted them. "This is Dr. Patel, who'll be assisting with today's procedure, and Dr. Levinson from the CDC's Division of Parasitic Diseases." Dr. Levinson stepped forward, his manner quietly authoritative. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your case, if you're feeling up to it. Your situation represents an unusual transmission vector that we'd like to document." Walter glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll try to help," he agreed. Dr. Levinson pulled up a chair and opened his portfolio, revealing a notepad and several official-looking forms. "First, I'd like to confirm the suspected source. Your daughter brought you a wooden carving from Brazil approximately 5 months ago?" "That's right," Walter confirmed. "A small jaguar statue, about so big." He indicated the size with his hands. "And where was this statue displayed in your home?" "On my bedside table," Walter answered. "Right next to where I sleep." Dr. Levinson made a note. "And when did you first notice the skin lesions?" Walter frowned, trying to pinpoint the timeline. "About 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. Started on my right arm." "Did you notice anything unusual about the statue? Any small holes, sawdust, or insect activity?" Walter shook his head. "Nothing I can recall. It just looked like a normal wooden carving." Dr. Levinson continued his questioning for several more minutes, establishing a detailed timeline of Walter's symptoms and the progression of the infestation. Throughout the interview, his clinical detachment occasionally gave way to flashes of genuine concern, a humanity beneath the scientific inquiry that Walter found reassuring. "One last question," Dr. Levinson said, closing his notebook. "Is the statue still in your apartment?" Walter hadn't considered this, and the implication sent a chill through him. "Yes," he answered. "On my bedside table." "We'll need to retrieve it," Dr. Levinson said, looking to Sarah. "There could be more viable eggs or larvae that pose a public health risk." Sarah straightened, reaching for her purse. "I have the key to Dad's apartment. I can go get it after his procedure." "I'd prefer to send a trained team," Dr. Levinson countered gently. "No offense, Miss Thompson, but proper handling requires specific protocols." "We'll need your permission and the key, of course." Sarah hesitated, then nodded, digging through her purse for the spare key Walter had given her years ago, a key she had never used until Eleanor called her about his collapse. "Should I be worried about my own apartment? I transported the statue from Brazil." "It's unlikely that any eggs would have survived and remained viable for this long without finding a host," Dr. Levinson assured her. "But if you'd like, we can arrange an inspection as a precaution." The conversation was interrupted by a nurse announcing that the procedure room was ready. As Walter was prepared for transport, Dr. Blackwell explained the plan for the day. We'll remove the remaining larvae, then start you on a stronger course of antibiotics to address the secondary infections. Given your overall condition and the extent of the infestation, we're looking at least 3 more days of hospitalization. Walter nodded, resigned to both the medical necessity and the mounting costs. As he was wheeled out, Sarah walked alongside, her hand resting lightly on the rail of the gurney. "I'll be waiting when you're done," she promised. "And Dad? No more secrets, okay? Not about health, not about money, not about anything important." "No more secrets," Walter agreed, reaching up to squeeze her hand before the orderlies wheeled him away. The second extraction procedure was similar to the first, but somehow worse. The remaining larvae were deeper, more established, requiring more extensive manipulation to remove. Despite the local anesthetic, Walter felt every pressure, every movement beneath his skin with heightened sensitivity. The knowledge of what was happening, of creatures being pulled from his flesh, made the physical sensations all the more unbearable. Dr. Blackwell worked methodically, her focus absolute as she extracted each larva and placed it in a specimen container. Dr. Patel assisted silently, her movements synchronized with the senior physicians through the unspoken language of surgical teamwork. "Almost done, Mr. Thompson," Dr. Blackwell assured him after what felt like hours. "Just 2 more to go. You're doing very well." Walter had retreated into his mind during the procedure, seeking refuge in memories of better times, building Sarah's treehouse when she was 10, teaching her to drive on empty country roads, walking her down the aisle at her wedding to David, a marriage that had ended after only 3 years. He clung to these moments, using them as shields against the horror of his present reality. When the final larva was removed, Dr. Blackwell allowed herself a small sigh of relief. "That's all of them, Mr. Thompson. 13 in this session, for a total of 29. More than we initially estimated, but they're all out now. 29 parasites. 29 living creatures that had been growing inside him while he ignored the warning signs, while he let pride and fear override common sense. The number seemed both horrifyingly large and strangely anticlimactic. The measurable sum of his suffering reduced to specimens in labeled containers. Back in his room, Walter found not only Sarah waiting, but also Eleanor, and surprisingly Mrs. Patterson from the library, both women sitting primly in visitor chairs with identical expressions of concerned determination. "The cavalry has arrived," Eleanor announced as Walter was transferred to his bed. "Sarah called me, and I brought reinforcements." Mrs. Patterson, Karen, Walter corrected himself mentally, remembering her first name from her library badge, smiled gently. "When you didn't show up for your usual Thursday visit, I was concerned." Eleanor filled me in on what happened. Walter felt a surge of embarrassment at having his condition shared so openly, but it was quickly replaced by a warm sense of being cared for, of mattering to people beyond his immediate family. "That's very kind of you," he managed, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "It's not kindness, it's community," Karen replied simply. "That's what we do in small towns. We notice when someone's missing." Sarah, who had been observing this interaction with interest, moved to adjust Walter's pillows with unnecessary attention. "Mrs. Patterson brought books," she mentioned. "And Eleanor brought more soup, which the nurses are storing for when you're feeling up to it." Walter looked from face to face, his daughter's tired but determined expression, Eleanor's no-nonsense concern, Karen's gentle attentiveness. A lump formed in his throat that had nothing to do with his physical condition and everything to do with the realization that while he had been isolating himself, believing he was sparing others the burden of his problems, a network of care had been forming around him anyway. Dr. Levinson entered, interrupting this moment of recognition. "I've arranged for a team to retrieve the statue from your apartment this afternoon," he informed Walter. "They'll decontaminate the area and check for any additional risk factors." "What about his return home?" Sarah asked. "Will the apartment be safe?" "We'll ensure it's completely clear before Mr. Thompson is discharged," Dr. Levinson assured her. "Though given the circumstances, you might want to consider alternative arrangements." Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "What circumstances exactly?" Dr. Levinson glanced at Walter, clearly weighing how direct to be. "Mr. Thompson's age, the severity of his condition, the likelihood of recurrent infections without proper wound care, these all suggest that independent living might be challenging in the immediate recovery period." The implications hung in the air. Walter felt a familiar resistance rising within him, the stubborn insistence on self-sufficiency that had defined his life and, ironically, led to his current predicament. But before he could voice this objection, a sharp pain lanced through his chest, stealing his breath and sending monitors into a frenzy of beeping. "Dad?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "Dad, what's wrong?" Walter couldn't answer. The pain intensified, spreading across his chest like fire. He was vaguely aware of Dr. Levinson pressing the emergency call button, of Eleanor ushering Karen from the room, of Sarah's face contorted with fear as medical personnel rushed in. "BP dropping, heart rate erratic," a nurse called out. "Possible septic shock. Start him on vasopressors," Dr. Blackwell ordered, having appeared as if summoned by the emergency. "And push another round of broad-spectrum antibiotics. Get a crash cart in here just in case." Walter felt a crushing weight on his chest, a darkness encroaching at the edges of his vision. Through the gathering shadows, he saw Sarah being gently but firmly moved away from his bedside, her mouth open in what might have been a cry or a protest, though he could no longer hear over the rushing sound in his ears. His last coherent thought before consciousness slipped away was an apology. To Martha for failing to care for himself as she would have wanted, to Sarah for adding his crisis to her already heavy burden, and strangely, to the tiny wooden jaguar that had sat innocently by his bedside, unknowingly carrying the agents of his undoing. When Walter next opened his eyes, the room was dimmer, the frantic energy replaced by the quiet hum of additional machines. A ventilator mask covered his face, helping to draw oxygen into lungs that felt constricted and heavy. An additional IV line had been added, delivering what he assumed were the antibiotics and other medications needed to combat the infection that had evidently spread beyond the surface wounds. Sarah sat beside him, her posture suggesting she hadn't moved for hours. Her head was bowed over her phone, fingers moving rapidly across the screen. Even in his compromised state, Walter recognized the familiar signs of his daughter in professional mode, handling a crisis with the same efficiency she brought to corporate emergencies. He tried to speak, but the mask and his own weakness prevented more than a small sound. It was enough, though, to catch Sarah's attention. Her head snapped up, relief flooding her features when she saw his open eyes. "Dad," she breathed, setting aside her phone and leaning closer. "You're back." Walter managed a small nod, his eyes questioning. "Septic shock," Sarah explained, correctly interpreting his silent inquiry. "The infections from the larvae sites entered your bloodstream, your blood pressure crashed. They've got you stabilized now, but—" She swallowed hard. "It was close, Dad. Really close." Walter closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this information. He'd known, on some level, that his condition was serious, but the reality of how close he'd come to dying, of how his stubborn refusal to seek help earlier had nearly cost him his life, hit him with new force. "The doctors say you'll need more intensive care now," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "At least a week in the hospital, maybe more. And after that you'll need skilled nursing care until you're fully recovered." Walter, tried again to speak, this time reaching up to move the oxygen mask slightly. "Cost," he managed, the word barely audible. Sarah's expression hardened. "Don't even start with that." She took his hand, her grip firm. "The financial stuff is being handled. Dr. Levinson has included your case in a CDC study that's covering part of the expenses. My insurance will cover some as your dependent. I've already added you. And for the rest—" She hesitated, then continued with renewed determination. "For the rest, we'll figure it out together. That's what family does." Walter felt tears gathering in his eyes, not from pain or fear, but from a complex mixture of gratitude, shame, and dawning understanding. For years, he had defined strength as self-sufficiency, as needing no one. But there was another kind of strength in vulnerability, in allowing yourself to be cared for, in recognizing that independence and interdependence were not mutually exclusive. Sarah seemed to read these thoughts in his expression. "It's okay, Dad," she said softly. "It's okay to need help. It's okay to let people who love you take care of you." Walter nodded slightly, too overwhelmed to attempt speech again. Sarah adjusted his oxygen mask back into place, then gently wiped the tears that had escaped down his cheeks. "Now get some rest," she instructed, her tone brooking no argument. "You've got a lot of healing to do, and I'm not going anywhere." As Walter drifted back into sleep, his daughter's hand still clasping his, he felt something shift within him, a surrender not to illness or age, but to the simple, profound truth that he had spent a lifetime trying to disprove. We are stronger together than we are alone. The next 3 days passed in a blur of medical interventions, medication adjustments, and gradual improvement. Walter's fever slowly receded, his vital signs stabilized, and the infection in his bloodstream responded to the aggressive antibiotic treatment. The oxygen mask was replaced with a less restrictive nasal cannula, allowing him to speak, though his voice remained weak. Throughout this critical period, Sarah maintained her vigil, leaving only for brief periods to shower at a nearby hotel or to take important calls related to her work. Walter observed how she managed these necessary absences, the careful way she explained exactly when she would return, the phone she left within his reach, the assurances that Eleanor or Karen would check in while she was gone. She was determined that he would never feel abandoned, not even for an hour. On the 4th morning after his crisis, Dr. Blackwell arrived with good news. "Your latest blood work shows significant improvement, Mr. Thompson. The septicemia is responding well to treatment. If this trend continues, we can start planning for your recovery phase." "When can I go home?" Walter asked, the question automatic despite his new understanding of his limitations. "Doctor." Blackwell's expression turned carefully neutral. "That depends on several factors. The infection sites need to heal completely. Your overall strength needs to improve considerably. And most importantly, you'll need appropriate support for continued wound care and monitoring." "He won't be alone," Sarah interjected from her position beside the bed. "I'm taking a family medical leave from work. I'll be with him during his recovery." Walter turned to her, alarmed. "Sarah, you can't. Your job is just a job," she finished firmly. "And the Family Medical Leave Act exists for exactly this reason. I've already filed the paperwork." Dr. Blackwell nodded approvingly. "That's excellent, Ms. Thompson. However, there's still the matter of Mr. Thompson's living situation. The CDC team reported that while they've thoroughly decontaminated the apartment, the layout presents challenges for someone with mobility issues during recovery. The third-floor location, the small bathroom, the lack of space for medical equipment." Walter felt a familiar defensiveness rising. That apartment, small and modest as it was, represented his last claim to independence. The thought of losing it, of being forced into some institutional setting, sent a spike of anxiety through him that registered on the heart monitor. Sarah noticed the change and placed a calming hand on his arm. "Dr. Blackwell, could you give us a few minutes to discuss this privately?" After the doctor left, Sarah pulled her chair closer to Walter's bed. "I know what you're thinking, Dad." "Do you?" Walter challenged weakly. "You're thinking that losing your apartment means losing your independence, your identity, your dignity." Sarah's directness was startling. "You're thinking it's the beginning of the end, the first step toward becoming completely dependent." Walter couldn't deny the accuracy of her assessment. "Wouldn't you think the same?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Martha that it made Walter's heart ache. "Maybe, probably. But I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few days, about us, about Mom, about what it means to be family." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "Do you remember what you and Mom did when David left me? When the divorce was finalized?" Walter nodded slowly. After Sarah's brief, painful marriage had ended, he and Martha had immediately offered their home as a refuge while she rebuilt her life. "You never once made me feel like a failure for needing that help," Sarah continued. "You never once suggested I was a burden. You created space for me to heal, and then you celebrated when I was ready to stand on my own again." Walter remembered those months. Sarah's gradual return to herself, the late-night conversations at the kitchen table, the quiet support he and Martha had offered without expectation or judgment. "That's what family does," Sarah said, echoing her earlier words. "We create safe harbors for each other during storms. We don't keep score. We don't measure worth by self-sufficiency." Walter felt something crumbling inside him. Not his resolve exactly, but the rigid framework of pride and fear that had structured his existence since Martha's death. "What are you proposing?" "I have a 3-bedroom condo in Chicago," Sarah said. "More space than I need. The building has an elevator, wide doorways, and it's 5 minutes from our oncologists," she corrected, including him in her medical journey. "You could have your own space, your own bathroom, your own furniture." Independence with a safety net. Walter absorbed this offer, turning it over in his mind. Chicago. A city he knew only from occasional visits. Far from the quiet rhythms of Millfield, from chess in the park, from the library where Karen saved books for him, but close to Sarah, close to the only family he had left. "What about your treatments?" he asked. "You shouldn't have to take care of me while you're fighting your own battle." Sarah smiled slightly. "That's the thing about battles, Dad. They're easier to fight when you're not alone." She took his hand. "I'm not suggesting this just for you. I'm being selfish, too. These past months of going through chemo alone have been hard. Harder than I let on. Having you there would help me as much as it would help you." Walter looked at their joined hands, hers still relatively young but showing signs of strain from her illness, his weathered by decades of work and age. Together they formed a circle of mutual need and support that seemed more complete than either hand alone. "I'll think about it," he finally said, unable yet to fully surrender the life he had built, limited though it was. Sarah nodded, accepting this partial victory. "That's all I ask." Later that day, as Walter dozed lightly, he overheard a conversation between Sarah and Eleanor, who had come for her daily visit, bearing fresh flowers and local gossip. "Considering moving him to Chicago with me," Sarah was explaining quietly. "But he's resistant, as you can imagine." "Of course he is," Eleanor replied matter-of-factly. "Walter's generation of men would rather suffer alone than accept help gracefully. My Harold was exactly the same way." "How did you handle it?" Sarah asked, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. Eleanor chuckled softly. "I didn't give him a choice. Simply presented it as a done deal. Men like Walter and Harold need to believe they're agreeing to something rather than having it decided for them." That feels manipulative, Sarah objected. It's not manipulation, dear, it's translation. You're translating your love and concern into language they can accept without feeling diminished. Eleanor paused. Besides, sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone we love is to save them from their own worst instincts. Walter kept his eyes closed, feigning sleep while absorbing this exchange. Was that what Sarah was doing? Translating her love into terms he could accept? Was his resistance to help really about independence? Or was it about fear? Fear of change, fear of vulnerability, fear of becoming the father Sarah had to care for, rather than the father who cared for her. As he drifted back into genuine sleep, these questions followed him into dreams where Martha appeared, sitting at their old kitchen table, looking exactly as she had before the cancer took hold. "You always were stubborn, Walter," Dream Martha said with fond exasperation, "but you weren't meant to do this alone. Neither of you were." When Walter woke, the answer he had been struggling toward finally crystallized with the clarity that sometimes comes after sleep has processed what wakefulness cannot. He would go to Chicago with Sarah, not as a dependent, but as a father still capable of offering strength even while receiving care. They would face their respective recoveries together, each helping the other in ways that would shift and evolve as circumstances changed. This decision, when he shared it with Sarah the next morning, brought tears to her eyes, and a smile of such genuine relief that Walter knew with absolute certainty that it was the right choice, perhaps the first truly right choice he had made since Martha's death had sent him spiraling into isolated self-reliance. "We'll make it work, Dad," Sarah promised, squeezing his hand. "One day at a time. One day at a time," Walter agreed, feeling the weight of weeks of fear and months of loneliness begin to lift from his shoulders. The road ahead would not be easy for either of them, but at least they would walk it together. On the 10th day of Walter's hospitalization, Dr. Levinson returned with a small team from the CDC, their expressions a mixture of professional interest and barely concealed excitement. Walter, now able to sit up in bed for extended periods, watched warily as they arranged themselves around his room with clipboards and tablets at the ready. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Levinson began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone about to deliver significant news. "We've completed our analysis of the specimens removed from your tissue, as well as the wooden carving from your apartment." Sarah, who had stepped out for coffee, returned just in time to hear this, quietly taking her usual position beside Walter's bed. Her presence had become so constant that Walter found himself automatically reaching for her hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. "What did you find?" Walter asked, bracing himself for more bad news. After everything that had happened, he'd developed a reflexive expectation of the worst. Dr. Levinson consulted his tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed report. The larvae were indeed human botfly, Dermatobia hominis, as we initially suspected. However, genetic sequencing revealed something quite remarkable. These specimens represent a variant previously undocumented in scientific literature. One of the younger researchers, unable to contain her enthusiasm, leaned forward. "It's potentially a new subspecies, Mr. Thompson. The genetic markers show adaptations we haven't seen before." Walter blinked, struggling to process this information. "Is that good?" Dr. Levinson smiled slightly. "From a scientific perspective, it's extraordinary. Your case has opened up a new avenue of research that could help us better understand how these parasites adapt and evolve, which in turn could lead to improved prevention and treatment methods." "And from my perspective," Walter pressed, unmoved by the scientific significance of his suffering. "From your perspective," Dr. Levinson acknowledged, sobering, "it explains the unusual virulence of your infection and the atypical presentation that may have contributed to the initial misdiagnosis. These organisms were particularly aggressive." Sarah's grip on Walter's hand tightened. "Does this change his treatment going forward?" "No," Dr. Levinson assured them. "The extraction was successful, and the current antibiotic regimen is appropriate. But it does underscore the importance of continued monitoring during recovery." Dr. Levinson hesitated, exchanging glances with his team before continuing. "There's another aspect of our findings I'd like to discuss. The wooden statue was indeed the source, but not in the way we initially assumed." He produced photographs showing the jaguar carving, now partially dissected in a laboratory setting. The wood itself had been treated with preservatives that should have prevented insect infestation. However, we discovered that parts of the statue, specifically the eyes and decorative elements, were made from a different material, a type of resin that incorporated organic compounds, including animal matter. "Animal matter?" Sarah echoed, her expression horrified. "In a tourist souvenir?" "It's not uncommon in certain traditional crafts," one of the researchers explained. "Some indigenous artisans incorporate natural materials with cultural or spiritual significance." "The botfly eggs were embedded in this resin," Dr. Levinson continued. "Protected from the wood preservatives and essentially dormant until conditions were right for hatching, specifically proximity to a human host over an extended period." Walter thought of the statue sitting innocently on his bedside table for months, waiting for the perfect moment to release its hidden passengers. The revelation was both disturbing and strangely vindicating. Even the most vigilant person couldn't have anticipated such an unusual transmission vector. "We've traced the origin of the carving to a specific region in the Amazon basin," Dr. Levinson added. "A remote area rarely visited by tourists. Miss Thompson, if I may ask, where exactly did you purchase this item?" Sarah's face had gone pale. "It wasn't a typical tourist shop. The company I was consulting for arranged a visit to a village as part of a potential sustainable development project. There was an artisan selling carvings." She trailed off, visibly distressed. "I bought it directly from the carver. He seemed so proud of his work, so honored that I wanted to bring a piece home." Dr. Levinson nodded sympathetically. "You couldn't have known. Even our field researchers would have had difficulty identifying the risk without specialized equipment." This scientific explanation of the infestation's origin, this absolution of both Walter's negligence and Sarah's unwitting role, should have provided comfort. Instead, Walter found himself struck by the cosmic absurdity of it all. A well-intentioned gift from a business trip on another continent, a rare variant of an already uncommon parasite, a combination of circumstances so improbable that they bordered on the surreal. "So what you're saying," Walter summarized dryly, "is that I hit the parasite lottery." A startled laugh escaped Sarah, quickly muffled behind her hand. Dr. Levinson's professional demeanor cracked slightly as he suppressed a smile. "That's one way of putting it, Mr. Thompson." After the CDC team departed, promising to share their full findings once the research was complete, Walter and Sarah sat in contemplative silence. The revelation had shifted something between them, a final release of the guilt and blame that had lingered despite their reconciliation. "I still can't believe I gave you parasites for your birthday," Sarah finally said, her attempt at humor underlaid with genuine remorse. "Better than the tie you gave me 2 years ago," Walter replied, his own voice light despite the gravity of the situation. "That pattern was truly horrifying." Sarah's laugh this time was genuine, if slightly watery. "God, Dad, only you could make jokes at a time like this." Walter shrugged, the movement no longer sending waves of pain through his healing tissue. "If I can't laugh about having been a human hotel for exotic bugs, what can I laugh about?" This moment of gallows humor was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Blackwell, accompanied by a woman Walter hadn't seen before, a brisk, professional-looking person in her 50s whose ID badge identified her as Dr. Reynolds from physical therapy. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Blackwell greeted him, "I have good news. Your latest blood work shows the infection is receding nicely. If this progress continues, we can consider discharging you in 3 days." Walter straightened, hope and anxiety mingling at this announcement. "Really? That soon?" "Don't get too excited," Dr. Blackwell cautioned with a small smile. "Discharge doesn't mean you're fully recovered. It just means you no longer require acute hospital care. You'll still need extensive follow-up treatment, wound care, and rehabilitation." Dr. Reynolds stepped forward. "That's where I come in. We need to start preparing your body for the transition. Today we'll begin with some simple exercises to assess your current strength and mobility." The next hour was humbling for Walter. Movements that once would have been effortless, sitting up unassisted, standing briefly, taking a few steps with support, now required tremendous concentration and effort. His body, weakened by infection and immobility, betrayed him at every turn. "This is normal," Dr. Reynolds assured him, noting his frustration. "You've been through a significant trauma. Recovery is a marathon, not a sprint." When the session ended, leaving Walter exhausted but oddly satisfied, Dr. Blackwell returned to discuss discharge plans. "Have you made a decision about your post-hospital care arrangements?" she asked, looking between Walter and Sarah. Sarah glanced at Walter, allowing him to answer for himself, a small courtesy that acknowledged his agency despite his compromised state. "I'll be moving to Chicago with my daughter," Walter stated, the words still strange on his tongue but no longer bitter. "She has room in her condo, and it's close to medical facilities. Doctor." Blackwell nodded approvingly. "Excellent. I'll arrange for your records to be transferred to specialists there. You'll need weekly wound checks initially, physical therapy, and follow-up blood work to ensure the infection doesn't recur." After she left, Walter noticed Sarah studying him with an odd expression. "What?" he asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You said that without flinching," she observed. "About moving to Chicago." Walter considered this. "I guess I did. 2 weeks ago, you would have rather died than admit you needed that kind of help." The assessment was harsh but accurate. Walter looked down at his hands. Still his hands, still capable, but now marked with the evidence of his ordeal. "2 weeks ago, I nearly did die rather than admit I needed help. Changes your perspective." Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and frowned slightly. "It's work." "I should take this." Walter nodded, watching as she stepped into the hallway to answer. Through the partially open door, he could hear fragments of her conversation, something about project timelines, staffing adjustments, interim leadership during her absence. The corporate language was foreign to him, but the underlying tension in her voice was not. She was fighting to protect her position while taking time away for both her treatment and his care. When she returned, Walter confronted her directly. "Your job's at risk, isn't it? Because of all this." Sarah hesitated, then sighed, sinking back into her chair. "Not officially. They can't fire me for taking FMLA leave or for having cancer. That would be illegal. But unofficially? Unofficially, there are ways to sideline someone without firing them. Important projects reassigned, invitations to key meetings accidentally overlooked. The slow death of a career by 1,000 paper cuts." She rubbed her temples. "But that's my problem to solve, not yours." Walter felt a familiar sensation, the parental instinct to protect, to fix, to shoulder burdens for his child. But this time he recognized that Sarah wasn't asking for solutions. She was simply sharing a truth, adult to adult. "You know," he said carefully, "I could look for an assisted living facility in Chicago instead, somewhere close enough for visits. but where you wouldn't have to be my full-time caretaker." Sarah looked up sharply. "Is that what you want?" Walter considered the question honestly. "No, but I want what's best for you more than I want what's comfortable for me." The smile that spread across Sarah's face was reminiscent of her childhood expressions of delight. Open, unguarded, luminous. "That," she said softly, "is the most dad thing you've said since this whole ordeal began." Before Walter could respond, the door opened again, admitting Eleanor and Karen, who had developed the habit of coordinating their visits. Eleanor carried a shopping bag while Karen balanced a potted plant, a small, flowering orchid. "We come bearing gifts," Eleanor announced. Karen picked the plant. I was voting for something less fussy, like a cactus, but she insisted this was more cheerful. "It's beautiful," Walter said sincerely, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Thank you both." Karen placed the orchid on the windowsill, adjusting it until the light fell just right on its delicate blooms. "Sarah mentioned you'll be moving to Chicago soon," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Walter nodded, suddenly aware of what his decision meant for these new-old friendships. Eleanor and Karen had become fixtures in his hospital room, their visits a reminder that he had connections beyond Sarah, that his life in Millfield had value beyond mere survival. "It's the right decision," he said, as much to convince himself as them. "Sarah has the space, and the medical facilities there are excellent." "Of course it is," Eleanor agreed briskly. "Doesn't mean we won't miss your grumpy face at the library and the park." "I was thinking," Karen ventured, her usually confident voice hesitant, "perhaps we could set up one of those video call things for chess games and book discussions. I could recommend titles, and we could talk about them, if you'd like." Walter felt a surprising swell of emotion at this offer, this extension of friendship across what would soon be hundreds of miles. "I'd like that very much," he managed. Eleanor, never one for sentimentality, opened her shopping bag. "Enough of that. I brought practical things for your trip. Compression socks for the drive, prevents blood clots, a travel pillow for your neck. And those audiobooks you mentioned wanting to try." As Eleanor unpacked these items, Walter was struck by the realization that he wasn't just leaving an apartment in Millfield. He was leaving a community that had formed around him so gradually that he'd barely noticed its development. The thought brought a pang of loss, but also a sense of gratitude. How strange that it had taken a medical crisis for him to recognize the connections that had been there all along. The conversation shifted to practical matters, the logistics of the move, the arrangements for storing or shipping Walter's belongings, the preparations Sarah was making in Chicago. Walter participated, but part of his mind remained fixed on the revelation of the morning. The exotic origin of his infestation, the scientific rarity of his condition, the sheer improbability of his ordeal. After Eleanor and Karen left, promising to return the next day, Walter turned to Sarah. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Levinson said." Sarah looked up from her laptop where she'd been researching medical transport options. "About the new subspecies?" "About everything. The statue, the remote village, the dormant eggs." Walter shook his head slowly. "What are the odds, Sarah? What are the odds that out of all the souvenirs in Brazil, you'd pick the one with mutant botfly eggs, that it would sit by my bed for months before hatching, that I'd ignore the symptoms until they nearly killed me, that Eleanor would intervene at exactly the right moment?" Sarah closed her laptop, giving him her full attention. "Are you heading toward a everything happens for a reason speech? Because I'm not sure I can handle existential philosophy on top of everything else today." Walter chuckled. "No, nothing so profound. I'm just struck by how many things had to go wrong and then right to bring us here. If any single element had been different." "You might never have gotten sick," Sarah finished. "Or you might have died before anyone knew what was happening. And we might never have had this time together," Walter added quietly. We might have continued our polite distance, our careful lies, our mutual protection that was really mutual isolation. Sarah was silent for a long moment, absorbing this perspective. So, you're saying that parasites brought us back together? That's disturbingly poetic, Dad. Walter laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at his healing wounds. I prefer to think of it as the universe having a very twisted sense of humor. The universe, or God, or random chance, Sarah mused. Whatever it was, I'm grateful for the outcome, if not the process. She reached for his hand again, a gesture that had become natural over the past 2 weeks. Even with everything, the fear, the pain, the uncertainty, I wouldn't trade this time with you. Walter squeezed her hand, marveling at how catastrophe had stripped away the barriers they had carefully constructed between them. Neither would I, he admitted, though I might have preferred a less dramatic family reunion. Thompsons don't do anything halfway, Sarah quipped, echoing one of Martha's favorite sayings. As evening approached, bringing with it the hospital's routine of shift changes, medication rounds, and dinner trays, Walter found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment of clarity. The initial ignorance of his condition, the stubborn refusal to seek help, the crisis that had nearly cost him his life, all forming a path that led improbably to reconciliation, to truth, to a future he could not have imagined just weeks ago. Dr. Blackwell appeared for her evening rounds, reviewing Walter's chart with evident satisfaction. Your recovery is proceeding remarkably well considering the extent of the infestation and the septicemia. Another few days and you should be stable enough for transfer to Chicago. What about my daughter's condition? Walter asked suddenly. Is it safe for her to be caring for me during her chemotherapy? Could my recent infection pose any risk to her? Dr. Blackwell's expression softened at this evidence of mutual concern. I've consulted with Ms. Thompson's oncologist. With proper precautions, good hand hygiene, avoiding close contact during the days when her immune system is most compromised after treatments, the risk is minimal. And there may actually be benefits to your shared recovery. Benefits? Walter echoed skeptically. Studies show that cancer patients with strong support systems tend to experience better outcomes, Dr. Blackwell explained. Less depression, better treatment adherence, even improved immune response. As for you having a purpose, in this case, being present for your daughter during her treatment, can accelerate rehabilitation. After the doctor left, Walter considered this medical endorsement of their plan. Science confirming what instinct had already suggested, that healing happened best in community, that mutual vulnerability could be a strength rather than a weakness. Sarah, who had been quietly working on her laptop during the doctor's visit, closed it with a decisive click. I just got an email from my boss, she announced. They've approved my extended leave and are arranging for my projects to be covered by the team. That's good news, Walter said, noting the slight reservation in her tone. Isn't it? Sarah nodded, but her expression remained troubled. It is. But there was something in the wording. We look forward to discussing your role when you're ready to return. It's corporate speak for your position might not exist anymore. Walter felt a surge of indignation on her behalf. After everything you've done for that company, the accounts you've brought in, the hours you've worked, that's business, Sarah said with a shrug that didn't quite conceal her hurt. No one's irreplaceable. You are to me, Walter said simply. Sarah's eyes glistened suddenly. Dad. I mean it, Walter continued, finding strength in his certainty. And you know what? If that company can't recognize your value, it's their loss. You're brilliant, dedicated, and you'll land on your feet. How can you be so sure? Sarah asked, vulnerability evident in her question. Because I know you, Walter answered. I've known you since before you knew yourself. And if there's one thing Thompsons do besides not doing anything halfway, it's bouncing back. Sarah smiled through her tears, her father's confidence seeming to bolster her own. Speaking of bouncing back, we should probably start planning the logistics of getting you to Chicago. Dr. Blackwell mentioned medical transport options, but we'll need to coordinate with your discharge date. As they discussed the practical details of the upcoming transition, Walter found himself thinking about the wooden jaguar statue that had changed everything. In many indigenous cultures, the jaguar symbolized transformation, the journey through darkness to rebirth. How fitting that this carving, this seemingly innocent souvenir, had initiated a transformation more profound than either of them could have anticipated. Later that night, after Sarah had left for her hotel and the hospital had settled into its nighttime rhythm of muted activity and dimmed lights, Walter lay awake, his body tired, but his mind alert. The CDC's revelations about the origin of his infestation had resolved one mystery, but deeper questions remained. Not scientific questions about parasites and transmission vectors, but personal questions about life and purpose in the wake of catastrophe. Who was he now, this man who had survived an exotic infestation and near death from sepsis? Who would he become in Chicago, away from the familiar patterns of his Millfield existence? How would he and Sarah navigate their dual recoveries, their mutual vulnerability, their evolving relationship? As he finally drifted toward sleep, Walter remembered something Martha had said during her final weeks, when pain and medication had sometimes granted her moments of startling clarity. The only certainty in life is change, Walter. The trick isn't avoiding it, it's learning to dance with it. For the first time since her death, Walter felt as though he might be learning the steps of that dance. The journey to Chicago took place 13 days after Walter had first been wheeled into County General's emergency room. The medical transport van was equipped with a surprisingly comfortable stretcher bed, monitoring equipment, and a cheerful paramedic named Steve, who seemed determined to make the 6-hour drive as pleasant as possible. Sarah followed behind in her car, checking in via phone at every rest stop, her voice a reassuring constant in what might otherwise have been an overwhelming transition. Walter watched through the van's windows as the familiar landscapes of his life receded, the small downtown of Millfield with its aging brick storefronts, the park where he played chess, the turnoff to the cemetery where Martha rested. There had been no time for a proper goodbye visit to her grave, a fact that weighed on him despite his certainty that Martha would have prioritized his medical needs over sentimental gestures. "You doing okay back there, Mr. Thompson?" Steve called, glancing in the rearview mirror. "We're about to hit the highway. Should be smooth sailing from here." "I'm fine," Walter replied, the phrase a reflex rather than a reality. In truth, he was a tumult of emotions, anxiety about the unknown future awaiting him, grief for the modest life he was leaving behind, hope for the healing that might come from this new arrangement with Sarah, and lingering physical discomfort from wounds still in the process of mending. The highway stretched before them, a concrete ribbon leading to a life Walter had never imagined for himself. At 60, he had assumed his future was largely settled. A quiet decline in Millfield, occasional visits from Sarah, perhaps a gradual surrender to the various ailments of aging. Instead, he found himself uprooted, redirected, transplanted like one of Martha's garden perennials that sometimes needed dividing to thrive. Chicago announced itself gradually, first in the thickening traffic, then in the distant skyline that grew more impressive as they approached. Walter had visited the city before, of course, but always as a temporary guest, a tourist passing through Sarah's world. Now he was arriving as a resident, albeit one whose stay had no defined endpoint. The van navigated through increasingly dense urban neighborhoods until it reached Sarah's building. A modern mid-rise in an area that Walter vaguely recalled was called Lincoln Park. The lobby was sleek and impersonal, with marble floors and abstract art on the walls, worlds away from the worn carpet and faded wallpaper of his apartment building in Millfield. Sarah was waiting when the van doors opened, her expression a careful balance of enthusiasm and concern. "Welcome to Chicago, Dad," she said, reaching for his hand as Steve prepared to transfer him to a wheelchair. "We're on the 4th floor, but don't worry, the elevator is very reliable." The apartment revealed itself to be larger and more elegant than Walter had anticipated. Open concept with large windows overlooking the city, modern furniture in neutral tones, and an overall sense of carefully curated minimalism that spoke of Sarah's taste for clean lines and uncluttered spaces. It bore little resemblance to the cozy, somewhat chaotic home where she had grown up, filled with Martha's collections and Walter's practical, functional furnishings. "I've set up the guest room for you," Sarah explained as she wheeled him through the main living area. "It's closest to the bathroom, and I've installed grab bars and a shower chair like the hospital recommended." Walter nodded, noting the evidence of careful preparation. The medical supplies organized on a side table, the hospital bed that must have been recently delivered, the stack of books on the nightstand that he recognized from his own collection in Millfield. Sarah had clearly gone to considerable effort to make this space feel welcoming, to incorporate elements of his home into hers. "It's perfect," he said, the simple words inadequate to express his gratitude for her thoughtfulness. "Thank you, Sarah." She squeezed his shoulder gently. "Let's get you settled. The home health nurse will be here in about an hour for your initial assessment, and I know you'll want to rest before then." The transfer from wheelchair to bed required more assistance than Walter's pride would have preferred, but Sarah managed it with a brisk efficiency that somehow preserved his dignity. Once he was settled, she adjusted pillows and checked his pain level with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who had been navigating medical systems herself. "Are you comfortable?" she asked, stepping back to survey her work. "Need anything for pain?" Walter shook his head. "I'm fine for now." He glanced around the room, taking in details he hadn't initially noticed: a framed photograph of him and Martha on their 30th anniversary, a small vase containing what looked like fresh-cut flowers from a florist, a television mounted on the wall opposite the bed. "You've thought of everything." Sarah's smile held a hint of sadness. "I had time to prepare while you were in the hospital, and honestly, it helped to focus on practical tasks. Gave me something concrete to do besides worry." Walter recognized this coping mechanism, this channeling of anxiety into action, as his own. How strange to see his mannerisms reflected in his adult daughter. To recognize the genetic and environmental inheritance that bound them together despite years of careful distance. "When's your next treatment?" he asked, the question a deliberate shift away from his own condition. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her collarbone, to the port hidden beneath her sweater. "Tomorrow morning. It's the 4th in this cycle, so I know what to expect. Fatigue, nausea for a couple of days, then gradually improving until the next round." "I wish I could go with you," Walter said, frustrated by his own limitations. "You will eventually," Sarah assured him. "Just not tomorrow. You need to focus on your own recovery first." She glanced at her watch. "I should let you rest before the nurse arrives." "I'll be in the living room if you need anything. Just use the call button we set up." Walter nodded, watching as she left the room, closing the door partway to offer privacy while remaining within earshot. Alone for the first time in his new surroundings, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of the transition, the strangeness of this place, the distance from everything familiar, the reversal of roles that had him dependent on his daughter's care. Exhaustion from the journey soon overtook these concerns, pulling him into a light doze from which he woke only when a gentle knock announced the arrival of the home health nurse, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor who introduced herself as Patricia. "Mr. Thompson," she greeted him, moving efficiently to set up her equipment. "I'll be overseeing your home care for the next few weeks." Today, we'll do a comprehensive assessment, change your dressings, and establish a care schedule. The examination was thorough but not uncomfortable. Patricia's clinical gaze assessing his healing wounds with professional detachment. These are closing nicely, she observed, applying fresh dressings to the extraction sites. Dr. Blackwell did excellent work. You should have minimal scarring, all things considered. Walter found this assessment oddly reassuring, the idea that his body would eventually bear little external evidence of the horror it had endured. "What's the timeline for full recovery?" he asked. Patricia considered the question as she made notes in her tablet. "Wound healing, another 2 to 3 weeks. Strength and stamina. That depends on how diligently you follow the physical therapy regimen. Most patients in your situation are back to about 80% of their baseline within 2 months." 2 months. The time frame stretched before Walter like an unpaved road, full of potential obstacles, but also the promise of progress. By Christmas, he might be largely recovered. By the new year, perhaps even independent again. But independent where? The question materialized unbidden. Would he return to Millfield once he was physically capable? Would he find a new place in Chicago? Or would this temporary arrangement with Sarah evolve into something more permanent? These questions still occupied his mind when Sarah returned after Patricia's departure, carrying a tray with soup and crackers. "The nurse said you should try to eat something," she explained, setting the tray on the adjustable table beside the bed. "Nothing too heavy for the first day." Walter nodded, suddenly aware of his hunger. The soup was clearly homemade, a chicken and rice variety that bore a striking resemblance to Martha's recipe. "Did you make this?" he asked, taking a cautious spoonful. Sarah nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "I found Mom's recipe box when I was packing up some of your things. Thought familiar food might help with the transition." The simple thoughtfulness of this gesture, the effort to recreate Martha's cooking despite her own health challenges, caught Walter unprepared. He felt his throat tighten with emotion that he quickly disguised by focusing on the soup. "It's good," he said after a moment, his voice deliberately casual. "Not quite as much pepper as your mother used, but good." Sarah smiled, recognizing the compliment beneath the critique. "I'll remember that for next time." She settled into the chair beside the bed, her own bowl of soup in hand. "So, first impressions of Chicago from what little you've seen?" The question was clearly an attempt at normal conversation, a reaching toward everyday interactions beyond medical concerns. Walter appreciated the effort even as he recognized its artifice. "Big," he answered honestly. "Busy. Different." He glanced toward the window where the fading afternoon light illuminated a slice of urban skyline. "I can see why you like it here, though. There's an energy to it." "It grows on you," Sarah agreed. "And this neighborhood is actually pretty quiet by Chicago standards. There's a little park 2 blocks over that reminds me a bit of the one in Millfield, just on a smaller scale. Once you're up to it, we can set up chess games there." Walter nodded, touched by her attempt to transplant elements of his Millfield routine to this new environment. "I'd like that. And I suppose there must be libraries nearby?" 3 within walking distance," Sarah confirmed. "Plus bookstores, coffee shops, a community center with veterans programs." She trailed off, perhaps sensing that she was overwhelming him with information. "But one step at a time, right?" "Right," Walter agreed, setting aside his half-finished soup. The day's journey had depleted what little energy he had regained during his hospital stay, and fatigue was rapidly overtaking him. Sarah noticed immediately. "You should rest," she said, gathering the dishes. "We've got nothing but time to figure all this out." After she left, Walter adjusted the bed to a more comfortable position for sleeping, his body gratefully surrendering to exhaustion, even as his mind continued to process the day's transitions. His last conscious thought before drifting off was a realization that despite the strangeness of his surroundings, Despite the uncertainty of the future, he felt something he hadn't expected: safe. The next morning brought the first test of their new arrangement. Walter woke to find Sarah already dressed, her appearance more carefully assembled than usual, makeup covering the pallor of her skin, a colorful scarf artfully arranged around her neck, clothes that hung a bit loosely but were clearly chosen to project normality and health. "Morning, Dad," she greeted him, bringing in a tray with toast, coffee, and his morning medications. "Sleep okay?" Walter nodded, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she set down the tray. "You're nervous about today's treatment," he observed. Sarah's smile faltered briefly. "Is it that obvious?" "To me it is." Walter struggled to sit up straighter, waving away her attempt to help. "Talk to me about it. What happens during these sessions?" Sarah settled on the edge of the bed, seemingly relieved to address the subject directly. "It's actually pretty boring. I sit in a recliner for about 3 hours while the drugs drip into my port. I usually bring work or watch something on my tablet. The nurses are wonderful, joking, bringing warm blankets, checking vitals." "And afterward?" Walter prompted gently. "Afterward?" Sarah's composure wavered slightly. "Afterward, I usually go home and curl up in bed for a while. The nausea doesn't hit right away, but the fatigue does. And by evening I'm generally feeling pretty rough." Walter absorbed this information, comparing it to his memories of Martha's chemotherapy experience. Every cancer was different, every treatment protocol unique, but the fundamental assault on the body remained consistent. "And you've been doing this alone? Coming home to an empty apartment afterward?" Sarah shrugged, a gesture meant to appear casual but failing to disguise the vulnerability beneath. "It's not so bad. I've gotten into a routine. Besides, lots of patients handle it alone." "Well, you're not alone anymore," Walter stated firmly. "I may not be able to go with you today, but I can damn well be here when you get back." The relief that flashed across Sarah's face confirmed what Walter had suspected, that beneath her capable exterior his daughter had been profoundly lonely in her illness, just as he had been in his. "Thanks, Dad," she said simply. Patricia, the nurse, arrived shortly after Sarah left for her treatment, bringing with her a physical therapist named Miguel, who led Walter through a series of gentle exercises designed to rebuild strength without compromising his healing wounds. The session was challenging but productive, leaving Walter with a sense of progress that helped offset the frustration of his limitations. "You're doing really well for someone who was hospitalized with sepsis 2 weeks ago," Miguel encouraged him as they finished. "Just remember to rest between exercises. Recovery isn't linear. You'll have good days and setbacks. The key is consistency." After they left, Walter found himself alone in the apartment for the first time. The silence was different from the solitude of his Millfield apartment, less familiar but somehow less oppressive. Here, the solitude was temporary, the silence a brief interlude rather than a defining condition of his existence. He used the walker that Patricia had provided to make his way slowly into the main living area, his body protesting the exertion, but his mind determined to prepare for Sarah's return. In the kitchen, he found the ingredients for tea, one of the few comforts he knew how to provide. Filling the electric kettle was a surprisingly exhausting task, but he managed it, along with locating mugs and the box of ginger tea that he remembered Martha drinking during her treatments. By the time the front door opened, announcing Sarah's return, Walter had established himself in the living room recliner, the tea tray set on the coffee table, a show queued up on the television, small accomplishments that nonetheless represented a victory over his limitations. Sarah entered looking markedly different from her departure, her careful makeup now emphasizing rather than concealing her pallor, her shoulders slumped with fatigue, her movements measured as if to conserve dwindling energy. She paused in surprise at the sight of Walter in the living room. "Dad, should you be up?" "Probably not," Walter admitted with a small smile. but I wanted to be here when you got back. Tea's ready, ginger like Mom used to drink." Sarah's expression softened into something between gratitude and concern. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Walter replied simply. "Come sit down before you fall down." Sarah complied, sinking into the sofa with a sigh that seemed to release not just air, but the performance of wellness she had maintained all morning. "The treatment went fine," she reported, anticipating his question. "Standard protocol, no complications." Walter nodded, pouring the tea with hands that shook only slightly from the exertion of his earlier activities. "I thought we could watch that British baking show you mentioned. The one where nobody yells and everyone's supportive." The small smile that crossed Sarah's face was worth every painful step he had taken to prepare for her return. "That sounds perfect." They settled into a companionable silence, the gentle competition of amateur bakers providing an undemanding backdrop to their mutual recovery. Walter noticed how Sarah curled slightly inward as the afternoon progressed, her body's response to the chemicals coursing through her veins becoming more pronounced. Without comment, he adjusted the throw pillow beside her, located the Afghan folded over a nearby chair, and handed her the remote control, small gestures of care that required no acknowledgement. By early evening, Sarah's nausea had progressed to the point where she retreated to her bedroom. Walter, exhausted himself but determined to be of use, managed to prepare a simple dinner of toast and broth that he brought to her on a tray. "I'm not sure I can eat anything," she admitted, looking at the food with evident apprehension. "Just try a few sips," Walter encouraged. "Remember what the doctors always told your mother. Even a little nutrition helps the body fight back." Sarah nodded, making a valiant effort with the broth, while Walter sat quietly beside her, his presence offering what his limited physical capabilities could not. When she finally set aside the mug, having managed about half its contents, he felt a disproportionate sense of accomplishment. "Thank you," Sarah said softly. "Not just for the soup. For being here." Walter reached out to brush a strand of hair from her forehead, a gesture he hadn't made since she was a child. "Where else would I be?" The irony of their situation was not lost on either of them, both ill, both recovering, both in need of care, yet determined to provide it to the other. There was a certain absurdity to their mutual caretaking, but also a profound rightness to it, as if they had finally found the genuine connection that had eluded them for years. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Sarah murmured, echoing their conversation from the hospital. "The walking wounded," Walter agreed with a wry smile, "but still walking." The days fell into a pattern after that, a rhythm of recovery punctuated by visits from healthcare providers, quiet meals together, and the gradual strengthening of both bodies and relationship. Walter's wounds continued to heal, the extraction sites closing into small, puckered scars that would eventually fade to faint reminders of his ordeal. Sarah's chemotherapy side effects followed their predictable cycle, 3 days of misery followed by a gradual return to relative normalcy until the next treatment. 2 weeks into their cohabitation, Walter received a call from Dr. Levinson at the CDC, requesting a virtual meeting to discuss the findings from his case. Sarah set up her laptop at the dining table, positioning it so both of them could participate in the video conference. Dr. Levinson appeared on screen, looking much as he had in person, but with the slightly flattened affect of digital communication. "Mr. Thompson, Ms. Thompson, thank you for making time for this meeting. We've completed our analysis of the specimens and the artifact, and I wanted to share our conclusions personally." Walter nodded, feeling a peculiar mix of curiosity and dread. Part of him wanted to put the entire ordeal behind him, while another part needed the closure that scientific explanation might provide. As I mentioned during our last conversation, the larvae represent a previously undocumented variant of Dermatobia hominis. Duck. Levinson began, sharing his screen to display microscopic images that meant little to Walter but apparently held significance for the scientific community. We've published our findings in the Journal of Parasitology, and there's been considerable interest from researchers in tropical medicine. I'm thrilled to be famous among bug scientists, Walter remarked dryly. Dr. Levinson smiled slightly. Your case has actually led to a re-evaluation of screening protocols for imported artifacts. The Department of Agriculture and the CDC are jointly developing new guidelines for customs inspections of handcrafted items from regions where myiasis is endemic. Sarah leaned forward, her expression intent. So this might prevent someone else from going through what my father experienced? That's precisely the point, Dr. Levinson confirmed. Your father's case, while unfortunate for him personally, may help protect others from similar infections. Walter considered this. The idea that his suffering might serve some greater purpose, might prevent another person from enduring the same horror. It was a small consolation, but a consolation nonetheless. There's one other matter I wanted to discuss, Dr. Levinson continued. The CDC maintains a patient assistance fund for cases of exceptional public health significance. Given the research value of your case and the data it's provided, you qualify for financial support to offset your medical expenses. Walter blinked in surprise. How much support are we talking about? The committee has approved coverage for 70% of your hospital costs, not covered by Medicare, Dr. Levinson replied. It's not complete compensation, but it should significantly reduce your financial burden. The news was unexpected, a rare instance of bureaucracy working in his favor rather than against him. Walter glanced at Sarah, whose expression mirrored his own astonishment. That's very generous, Walter managed. Thank you. After the call ended, Sarah closed the laptop, her movements deliberate as she processed this development. Well, she said finally, that's one less thing to worry about. Walter nodded, feeling a weight lift that he hadn't fully acknowledged was there. The financial specter of his medical crisis had been hovering at the edges of his consciousness, a problem deferred but not resolved. Now, at least, it seemed manageable rather than catastrophic. It's almost funny, he remarked. All those years of pinching pennies, avoiding doctors because of the cost, and now I get a windfall because the bugs that nearly killed me turned out to be scientifically interesting. Sarah shook her head, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth despite the grim subject matter. The universe really does have a twisted sense of humor. That evening, as they sat together in the living room, Walter working on the crossword puzzle that had become part of his daily routine, Sarah reviewing work emails on her tablet, he found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment of quiet companionship. I've been thinking, he said, setting aside the newspaper, about what happens next. Sarah looked up, her expression carefully neutral. What do you mean? I mean, after I'm recovered, after your treatments are finished. Walter gestured vaguely at their surroundings. This arrangement was supposed to be temporary. A solution to an immediate problem. It doesn't have to be, Sarah said quickly, then seemed to catch herself. I mean, unless you want it to be, unless you're eager to get back to Millfield. Walter considered this. The prospect of returning to his solitary existence in the small apartment that had been his refuge and his prison. He thought of the empty chair across from his at the breakfast table, the silent evenings broken only by the television's chatter, the long nights when memories of Martha were his only company. I'm not eager, he admitted finally, but I don't want to impose on your life indefinitely. You'll go back to work eventually. You might start dating again. You should have your space, your privacy. Sarah set down her tablet, giving him her full attention. Dad, having you here these past weeks, it's been good. Not just helpful, but good. I've liked having someone to talk to at the end of the day. Someone who notices if I'm not feeling well but doesn't treat me like I'm made of glass. She hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic vulnerability. I've been lonely here, if I'm being honest. Work filled the days, but the nights were empty. Walter recognized the feeling she described, the hollowness of achievements that couldn't be shared, of small daily victories and defeats witnessed only by oneself. It had been his constant companion since Martha's death. "What are you suggesting?" he asked carefully. "That I stay? Permanently?" "Not necessarily permanently," Sarah clarified, "but longer than just your recovery period. Maybe we try it for 6 months, see how it works for both of us. The guest room is yours for as long as you want it. And if you decide you miss Millfield, or if we drive each other crazy, we can reevaluate." The offer hung between them, not a solution born of crisis this time, but a deliberate choice to continue what they had begun under duress. Walter thought of Eleanor and Karen back in Millfield, of the chess games in the park, of Martha's grave that he visited on her birthday and their anniversary. But he also thought of the meals shared with Sarah, of the quiet understanding that had developed between them, of the comfort of not facing illness and recovery alone. 6 months, he agreed finally. "We'll see how it goes." The smile that illuminated Sarah's face confirmed that he had made the right decision, not just for himself, but for both of them. In the aftermath of dual crises, they had discovered something neither had anticipated, that helping each other heal had begun to heal the distance between them as well. As the first snow of the season began to fall outside the windows of Sarah's their Chicago apartment, Walter felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since Martha's death. Not the resignation he had mistaken for acceptance in Millfield, but genuine contentment, the quiet satisfaction of being where he was meant to be, with the person who mattered most. The parasites that had nearly taken his life had, in their strange way, given him something precious in return, a second chance at being not just Sarah's father, but her friend, a second chance at family, a second chance at living rather than merely surviving. And for that, despite everything, Walter Thompson found himself oddly, inexplicably grateful. Walter's journey from stubborn independence to healing connection reminds us that it's never too late to rewrite our life's story. Like many of us in our golden years, he faced the twin demons of pride and isolation, choosing silence over vulnerability, distance over dependence. But when parasites of all things forced him to accept help, Walter discovered what we often forget. True strength isn't found in standing alone, but in allowing ourselves to be supported. His reconciliation with Sarah shows us that family bonds can be rebuilt, even after years of careful distance. Their mutual caregiving, each wounded yet determined to help the other heal, mirrors the paradox of aging. As our bodies become more vulnerable, our capacity for meaningful connection can actually deepen. Walter's story speaks to anyone who's ever refused help, hidden illness, or sacrificed relationships at the altar of self-reliance. It asks us, what walls have you built in the name of independence? And what might be waiting on the other side if you found the courage to let someone in? Share your own story of reconnection or a time when accepting help brought unexpected blessings. Has pride ever kept you from reaching out when you needed support?